All right, well, let's see how we're doing here. Going live. Let's see how we got. Get YouTube going. Oh, here we go. Here she comes. All right, so it's got to be recording on here somewhere. Why do I always miss this? Record to the cloud. All right. Looks like she's finally going. All right. I think we're about live here. Just waiting for myself to show up on YouTube, and there I am. Beautiful. Welcome, everyone, to Hash Church Season 11, Episode 26, the Aromatic Volatile episode. I'm not going to lie, pretty excited about this episode. It's been 3 to 4 months in the planning. As you can see, I'm not in my regular place at home. I'm actually in Manitoba right now, in Lac du Bonnet at a friend's house. Thank you, Nathan. And yeah, my son's out on the river, in the Winnipeg River, doing some fishing at a tournament, a walleye tournament with my uncle. So they're having a great time. And I managed to squeeze off this 4 hours to do this volatile organic compound episode today. So as always, how I want to start is by shouting out our sponsors, because without them, well, without them, we would have no sponsors. Let me just check it out here real quick. There should be a share button in here, shouldn't there? It's unbelievable how, there we go. My share button had disappeared. So we're going to start off with our good friends at the Press Club. And here we go. Trusted by top hash makers from around the world since 2016, the Press Club is your one-stop shop for award-winning solventless gear. From press bags to wash bags to presses to vessels, you'll find everything you need from wash to press. And of course, we're big fans of the Press Club and what they're doing in the community, so we're super excited to have them on board as an official sponsor for Hash Church. They've got the Made in the USA, patented pink stitch, zero blowout guarantee, small family-owned business. Support small family-owned businesses. Free expedited shipping on $75 or more and international shipping available. You can visit them at www.thepressclub.co and use the code HashChurch to take 10% off your purchase. Also, they will be in the chat throughout the day, throughout the show. So feel free to reach out and talk to them. They go by the name The Press Club, and they'll be in there for sure. I also wanted to shout out Puffco for powering Hash Church. Puffco's game-changing devices like the Sleek Peak Pro, the Versatile Proxy, and the Compact Pivot, all of which I have here today with me, and I'll be smoking during the show, bring unmatched style and performance, making extracts a vibe for everyone. Their passion for cannabis culture keeps our community blazing strong. Discover the Puffco difference at www.puffco.com, and you can follow them at PUFFCO at Puffco. So big shout out to those guys. Also, last but not least, Bubble Bag. We do remain the gold standard for water hash extraction, pioneered by the innovators who defined the craft. Built to last, these top quality bags come with a lifetime warranty, guaranteeing years of flawless performance with a legacy of excellence. The Bubble Bag team delivers unmatched reliability for enthusiasts and pros chasing premium hash results. Elevate your extraction game at www.bubblebag.com and use the code HashChurch10 for exclusive savings. So there we go. Got that out of the way. Let me see. I probably have some folks waiting in the room here. So let's get them admitted into the room and see how we're doing here. Jeremy. Jeremy's in the house. Nice to see his smiling face. Always enjoy my conversations with Jeremy. And I see Ian is also in the house from Abstracts. How you doing, guys? How you doing, Ian?
Hey Marcus, great to meet you finally. My
Yeah,
audio sound all right?
your audio sounds perfect. How about
Awesome.
you,
Good to hear.
Jeremy? Let's hear how
Hey
yours
Marcus,
sounds.
hey Ian, how are you guys doing?
Great.
Doing
Nice,
good, brother. Doing good.
good to see you. It's been a while.
It has been a while. Time goes by, doesn't it?
It does, long enough for Mr. Ziegler to grow a pretty impressive beard.
That
Um,
is impressive.
well,
Damn.
ooh, I wish I could smell what you've just shared.
It's strawberry lemonade and it smells exactly like lemonade. It's tripping me out.
Delightful.
Yes. Nice to see you, Nick.
Likewise. See everybody.
Also,
How was Colombia,
yeah.
Jeremy?
I'm in love. I've lived there most of the last year. I just moved out of the Hawaii house entirely. I am no longer there. And at almost 50 years old, I actually literally don't have a home. I'm going between regions, and it's a strange but exciting frontier. How are you
Where?
doing?
I'm doing okay. Where in Colombia are you?
Primarily going between Santa Marta and Medellin, but I think one of the great delights about Colombia is that 45-minute flight, you're in the capital. I'm on a 45-minute drive from Santa Marta, and I'm in Tirona and this like primordial wonderland. Rarely Cartagena. Cali is incredible.
Mhm.
I just, it's an amazing country.
Yeah, I
Hey,
grew up in
Mark,
Cali. So, hey, Marco.
you grew up in Cali?
Yeah,
What? Oh my gosh, almost
I'll talk to you about it
salsa.
sometime.
Oh, that's amazing. I love it there. It's an incredible place. Nice. Mark,
Yeah,
it's been a
that's
while.
where Maramberos
Hey,
is
Jeremy,
in
what's
Cali.
going on, buddy? How are you?
Welcome, Dr. Mark.
Happy to
Hey,
see you.
Marcus, Ian, Nick, how you doing? Well, we got a lot of brains in the room today. Uh-oh.
What's
We're
up,
gonna
Mark?
squeeze it out. We're gonna squeeze out the juice today.
Things might boil over. Oh gosh, this is great. Thank you, Marcus. This is awesome to be able to talk about this topic here on Hash Church.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a long one in the making, kind of really sort of inspired by Nick originally coming on to the show and kind of breaking down some of the things they were doing over at Yakima with the aromatic volatiles. And I mean, for me, that was the first time I'd heard thiols and thiolates and, a lot of these sort of names. It really was kind of, to me, and I could completely be wrong, it was really a turning point in the conversation where terps just wasn't covering it anymore. And it was really Nick who was the first person on Hash Church several years ago now to talk about these compounds. I'd never heard about them before. I really was also of the natural way of a human being to think is, oh, if there's the most of that one, that's what it is. And thiols and thiolates, at least from the minimum, the little bit of stuff that I gathered from Nick and a few others, seem to not follow that rule whatsoever, that they were
Well,
really
we're
the
we're here to
smallest
say that
percentage.
we're here to say that there's a connection. There's a connection in the biochemistry and the biochemical origin. Mother Nature's atom economy is such that, sulfur is a highly sought after element in biochemistry and biology in general. So it's thought of again that there's a transfer of sulfur from an amino acid called cysteine through a prenylation reaction. So prenylation is a very common post-translational modification of proteins, right? So proteins are made, in and around the ribosome, right? We all know it's central paradigm of biology, right? Messenger RNA goes to the ribosome, makes protein, and then after the proteins are made, some of the functional groups in proteins are modified chemically. And a very common a modification is the post-translational modification of cysteine through a terpenylation reaction to make prenyl cysteine, which, yeah, Ian, since we last talked about biosynthesis, I found this article that talked about this. I should almost share my screen. Maybe I will in a little bit. It talked about uh, a lyase enzyme that takes that prenylcysteine and decarboxylates and loses the ammonia group, and you end up with a priothenol or a prenylated thiol. Could I share my screen, Marcus? Is that possible? I
Yeah,
know
I'd
we're
be
all
very
very
Absolutely
interested.
not. No, no, we're not doing that.
no
I'm
sharing
just
screen.
joking.
All right, I'm sending it. I gotta send a request to do that.
And Mark, I gotta preface you. We have all the data now on all this stuff.
Oh, so you see,
Yeah,
you
just
already
just
figured it
give
out.
me a few months,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
this will
you already
be
figured it all out. So
yeah.
can you see my screen?
Not yet, but I did
Not
give
yet.
you permission to share it. You should be able
Oh,
to push that share button and
okay, let
get
me
in
try
there.
now. Okay. So when I saw this, Ian, I got
I
really
still don't
excited
see it.
because
Oh, there it is.
I had not seen this before. And this was just
Oh
again
yeah, the
after,
beta lyase. Yep, that's what I
yeah,
figured. I'm
this
sure
bit
Nick. That's the one Nick's familiar with too from the hop chemistry.
right. And so it's super interesting because I also I pull up this review too. I don't know, can you see that review that I
Yep.
have there? Yeah, this is just a great review. I mean, this was written in 2008 and it goes through most of the types of compounds. I mean, again, it falls short of identifying the some of the compounds that you guys have identified, but isn't it true though that these are all basically prenyl thiol precursors that could come very well from the transfer through this prenylation reaction
Yeah.
through this amino acid cysteine?
Yeah. So
I
and this actually I can't say too much because again we're literally collecting the
sorry.
last bit of data for this paper. The story's a little bit more complex than that, but in a cool way. But basically, there's multiple types of precursors that we found, and so the story is even richer than just what you just explained, Mark. And like I said, in a few months, hopefully, we have this out. Once we finalize some of our LC data collection.
That's so cool. I mean, again, it's like this is to me like the real cutting edge of like, where these two things kind of come together. The other thing that I always think about when I think of this is like with sulfur anyway. So where does the sulfur in cysteine comes from? It comes from homocysteine. Well, where does the sulfur in homocysteine comes from? It comes from methionine. Where does it come from in methionine? It comes from H2S, right? And so there it can come back to the primordial soup, right? Because when you have sulfate reducers, sulfate reduce. So like when you go down to the ocean and it sometimes smell sulfury down there, that what you're smelling sometimes is H2S that's made as a byproduct of sulfate reducing bacteria, which seems to thrive in brackish and saltwater kind of environments. So that's sometimes that smell that you smell down in dried up lagoons and stuff like that that'll really smell bad. It's because you have sulfate reducers in there. And so yeah, so that sulfur again, the atom economy is there. I mean, it's got to come from somewhere. So it comes from rotten eggs, which is H2S, which
Yeah,
comes from sulfate reducing
yeah.
bacteria.
And so I'll just mention, guys. I put together a bunch of vignettes that we've kind of looked at research wise over the years, and some of that's related to the source of sulfur. So we've done some nutrient studies I've alluded to in the past, Mark, we might have talked about, but I have that data actually to show because we're not going to really do much with it because it was just kind of a one off. So if you guys want, I can blow through that. But I just want to mention actually, Nick, or sorry, Mark, you just mentioned the beta lyase. That's a well-known and well-described enzyme in yeast, and it's actually in hops as well, I believe. It's encoded by the IRC7 gene, so they know
Yeah, this was
genetically.
mammalian. I think this is
Okay,
I think from a bovine brain, I
gotcha.
think.
So so I know that people have done work, and Nick, you can definitely chime in because I know you worked at Yakima Chief, so you probably know this up and down. But they've engineered yeast to overexpress this beta lyase enzyme so that you have this thiolized yeast that if you have more of the precursor molecules, so these cysteine bound 3-mercaptohexyl, blah blah blah, it can release more of them into your beer and make it have more of those tropical notes. What I haven't seen though is specifically this conjugate, the prenyl cysteine conjugate. And but the reason I'm bringing this up is because you know a while back when we were hypothesizing kind of like the biosynthetic origins of these compounds, these VSCs that we found, we were interested in, well, there has to be some sort of genetic underlying reason there, right? Especially because we see certain varieties have higher amounts than others. And so, we went and blasted. So, just going to, the government website where you can take a genome and you can blast a sequence against it. And there were some homologs for that lyase in the cannabis genomes that were provided.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that not only are the precursors there that you need, but also the machinery is probably in there as well. And so you guys, I'm sure, Jeremy, you had just seen the paper, the pangenome paper that, I'll be honest, I'm not a geneticist, so it's way over my head. I mean, that Nature paper was just an absolute beast, but you know, that data dump would be such a great place to mine for differences to try to like identify like if that lyase is produced in higher amounts in certain varieties over others. So yeah, like everything is converging right now. We know the chemistry, we have great inkling on kind of the genetic mechanisms. Now we just got to put it all together, and so that's kind of hopefully what we'll be doing in the next year.
Well, the sulfur had to come from somewhere, right?
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
one of the things that we have noticed, and especially on the thiolized yeast angle, the vast majority of the precursors actually come from the malt. And so that's where all the amino acids are. And so a lot of that, and then there's a lot of the other sulfur containing compounds that are uptaken by the grain plant during growth. And I mean, you can look at if you want to talk about sort of root sources, not going back to hydrogen and iron, but looking at magnesium sulfate, calcium sulfate, like gypsums, a lot of those things that are put on the fields just for calcium, but also primarily, but also for that sulfate. And that sulfate is then used by those bacteria, those soil bacteria, and is liberated as H2S, or it can be taken up by the plant once it's converted. So that's sort of a good source source of those nutrients and the sort of origin of the sulfur that's added. You can see some really interesting things by looking at the different precursors and the compounds that come out at the other end of these reactions. So, for example, methionine and cysteine will deliver different aromatic. They'll be preferentially going one way or another. And so I don't remember which one it is, but one of them is much more likely to result in thioates versus just straight thiols. And I don't remember which one it is. Cysteine, yeah. Okay. Yeah. And those are the garlic, stinky, sometimes dank. Those are aromatics. So,
right.
It's really cool when they start interacting with terpenes and other aromatic compounds, and the prenylation reactions get even more complicated, and you get things like terpinolene thiol, which is obviously the very shortened name of it, which is one of the more crucial elements in ruby red grapefruit aroma and flavor. So that's pretty cool to play with that.
Yeah, and I mean, then there's grapefruit mercaptan, right? Which has
that's the terpinolene thiol.
Yeah, yeah, it has such a low odor threshold. It's crazy.
Oh, tiny.
And as soon as you get above it, it's nasty. It's gross.
It's like burning diesel and rubber, and it's terrible. Same thing with 3-MH or 3-mercaptohexanol. Yep. At levels of just tiny volumes. Like I remember I was working with someone, and we got some new standards in, and our aromatic chemist came out. I don't know who came out with a single drop on a pin. He's like, "Is it supposed to smell like this?" And walked through the lab. We had to leave the building for a 4-hour lunch because it was so strong.
Yeah, you got to do that in the hood, that's for sure. Or you'll stink out the building for a week.
Oh, yeah. It's awful. Yeah. But at low levels, it's delicious. It's passion fruit. So
right,
it's
and
cool.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because it does seem like, at least in cannabis, and I'd say hops as well. It seems to make these compounds in the right amounts where they're not beyond that sort of, they're still pleasant. I've never really smelt a cannabis plant that, if you smell prenyl-mercaptan or prenyl thiol like in high concentration, it's pure rubber. It's just that kind of gross sulfuric note that it kind of becomes. But I've never really seen levels throughout all our runs that really reach those kind of levels that we've done when we kind of calibrate our noses in the lab to, okay, this ppm, it's still good, it's skunky, it's gassy, okay, now it's kind of burnt, right? Yeah. And so there are these kind of thresholds or plateaus where it really starts to change to the human nose, which, by the way, I just got to mention, I have a few slides on how humans detect sulfur compounds that I can share that is, I think, super fascinating, and I'd love to share that when we can.
Great. Actually, this is perfect because you just started mentioning thresholds and all that stuff, and I have some. I wanted to talk about this a little bit and look at it instead of from the plant side. Let's look at it from the people side, because this is something that is not always discussed as much, and people sort of tend to assume a lot of things rather than look at kind of what's established, because it is laborious. Is it my code okay to go to a little bit of linguistics and philosophy here and neuro?
Go for it.
Okay.
I'm fine with it.
So we all smell things unless we are unfortunate enough to have anosmia, the inability to smell, but we also all have thresholds and sensitivities and blindnesses. So there are some compounds that people can be very, very sensitive to at very low levels. For example, I'm going to use a beer example. I am sensitive to diacetyl at an extremely low level, like well below threshold. And I have people who are completely blind to it, and they don't detect it at all. And just like you said, in terms of intensity, that intensity will vary between individuals, and that's a physical thing. That's a physical characteristic, and to some extent, you can learn to detect things a little bit. But if you have a true anosmia or true insensitivity, you're just not going to get it until it's way above threshold. And thresholds can be anything from parts per thousand to parts per trillion or quadrillion. And so, looking at that and trying to understand and making sure that people are reporting things consistently, and we agree, and sort of we agree to call things by certain terms, is really key to a good sensory exploration. So this is because we have different personal individual levels, but we also have a way of conceiving of these aromas, and it's really has to do with language. Is that there's all these linguistic theories about the signifier versus the signified, meaning and the philosophical theories where the word for something conveys the meaning of what that item or that entity is, but everybody's experience of that entity is going to be particularly individual, and this becomes even more sort of important when you start to consider regional differences or cultural differences, to say nothing of linguistic differences. And that's obviously informed by the experience that we have growing up and among the people that we surround ourselves with, what aromatics we're exposed to, what smells and flavors and stuff we're exposed to, and the terms we use to describe those. And so when we're talking about this, it can get very, very complicated. Like I can say, for example, this is one I love, is that we look at things like, so let's use some cannabis descriptors, okay? Grapefruit. A lot of people in the world have experienced grapefruit. That's fine. It's it's a citrus fruit that can be fairly easily spread around the world. But when you get to something like, say, wedding cake or cereal milk, how do you describe that? Do you think someone who grew up in rural China or in the mountains of Nepal, who are going to be exploring land races, and you're out there trying to find a cereal milk kind of aroma or cheese kind of aroma? Okay, well, what kind of cheese? French is going to be very different from Bhutanese, but then how are you going to describe what cereal milk is to someone? Because they probably will never have had it. Also, what kind of cereal? Cocoa Pops? Fruity Pebbles? Cheerios, whatever, what is it? And so when we start talking about these terms, one of the things that I always thought was really important was to try to break it down into constituent elements. If you're working in a lab and you're working with a team that has all that stuff, you can actually use the chemical names for things, or at least shorthands, because some of them are very long, but that's not really good for the layperson. But if you think about, okay, let's break down a variety's characteristic aromatics. So let's say this has really strong notes of blueberry muffins. Okay, but what are the notes that go into blueberry muffin? Obviously, there's blueberry, right? Which is it's going to be hard to break that down unless you start getting into compounds. But then there's also probably going to be some toffee notes, some bready notes, and some vanilla or something like that. And so you want to start using terms that are as sort of not all the way down, but reduced to a level that can be relatively understood by people based on the commonality of exposure. So people will have had black pepper, they will have had vanilla at some point in most areas of the world. And so if you can use descriptors that fit to the population that you're talking to, you're going to get much better results, and you're going to get much better sort of alignment between what you're talking about and what they expect. And so that's sort of one of the things that I like to see, is that and I've seen this to some extent more and more lately, but is people using descriptors that are a little bit more precise rather than sort of this all-encompassing thing. The problem is then that people don't normally have an experience of reconstructing a blueberry muffin in their mind from first compounds. So it can be very useful if you're sort of like into it, and you're really focusing on these things. But as a consumer, it's easier to say blueberry muffin. But when we're talking about on our side, on producer sides or on analytical sides, if we use those sort of those key descriptors, we're able to sort of build an aroma profile, which could be really useful. And when you said earlier, Ian, about hops not having, or hops and cannabis not having those extreme amounts of it, of like sort of the burnt rubber smells or something like that, I have had ones that ended up real real nasty, and that's usually because they were let hang for way too long. They were picked very, very late, and you do start getting that burnt rubber note towards the end of maturation, and also if they're dried
I've
too
heard
hard.
about that, Nick. And so Tom Nielsen works with us
Mhm.
now at Abstracts, and he's mentioned this, that especially with hops, there's this very, with many varieties, like this very narrow window, right? That's what you're referring to, where if you don't harvest right then and there, if you're past, it goes from grapefruit, citrus, whatever you want, black currant, to literally, savory sort of notes, kind of that burnt sort of smell. That's what you're
Mhm.
referring to. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw the same thing in cannabis, is that there are similar or at least analogous harvest windows. You will see the development of the much lighter and less easy to detect, or sorry, very simple to detect in the beginning, ester profiles and some of the aldehydes. And then those get kind of taken over as you go on, as the terpene production and the thiol production ramps up. And it remains to be seen if those compounds are gone from the plant in that later period of maturation, or have been seriously reduced through volatilization or what have you, or consumption and conversion, or if they're just getting completely overshadowed because the terpenes and the thiols are just so loud and so intense relative to a lot of these esters. And to separate out these very volatile compounds is a challenge at best, especially on any sort of commercial scale.
What's known about the
Yeah.
esters and the aldehydes? Are those known?
Well, Nick, that makes perfect sense to me what you just said too. We were just doing some data collection for some folks, and we were monitoring through flower, kind of how the volatiles were changing. And it's funny how the aroma literally, it's like cannabis, to at least the few times that I've done these sort of experiments, they start out much more sweet. So, exactly what you just said makes sense to me. The esters, the aldehydes coming in first, and then you get this exponential kind of ramp. And I have data on that showing these VSCs just exploding at the end of maturation, like you're saying. So, and that's where that gas comes in, super, super loud. But yeah, damn, I should go back and plot the esters as a different curve. I bet you would see this onset, and then the thiol. Well, the thiol, the level is going to be completely different. We'd have to normalize them, but I bet you would see these different onset time periods. That's really interesting. Damn.
What are
Uh,
they? What are they
Oh,
aliphatic?
oh my God, ethyl hexanolate, ethyl
yeah,
acetate,
yeah.
isoamyl acetate is banana. Ethyl hexanolate is kind of an anisey green or red apple flavor, red apple skin, kind of red delicious aroma. Just ethyl acetate gets a little bit more solventine. You get ethyl lactate is kind of pineapple and strawberry. You get all these different esters, and those are all related to. So those are all esters of acids, of organic acids, and so those acids, the presence of those are the requisite precursor for a lot of these esters. And these are in beer, for example. And so like all the ethyl ones, they have to have, there's an ethylene or an ethyl pathway in there, and they need to have that
Right.
substance to
Obviously.
react. Yeah. You mentioned about the plotting and sort of normalizing the data, Ian. Something that's really that I've found very useful is to include a relative intensity chart. And so you start to develop kind of what your thresholds are, or what this is when nobody detects it. This is when sensitive people detect it. This is when most people detect it. This is when only insensitive people detect it, so on and so forth. And then you can kind of build like a relative pungency scale on that. And then you can normalize your data by concentration, using that sort of approach. Because it's cool metabolically, but we're really talking about what people are actually experiencing. So trying to build those curves is going to be really helpful in normalizing that data.
Yeah,
Guys,
no.
I also see this as you refine hash into oils, you start to see a very similar dichotomy here, where it's almost the evolution of changing forms and refining it is also there's chemical reactions happening, and as a result, you're seeing completely different profiles, not totally completely different profiles, but very broad strokes away from where it was. It's perhaps for instance, this blueberry banana I have here, when it was fresh pressed, it was much sharper. And then when it was cured, it was much more banana OG, right? It had
Mhm.
this banana thiol took over. And I think, watching that happen and taking data over the years, looking at this, I wonder, guys, from your perspective, Nick, is there a way for us to tell a better story to the consumer? Hey, what is here? A cold cure versus a fresh press, and the value that they have in taking that if they're a patient, because you're getting different chemical constituents, so
Mhm.
they're fundamentally different types of medicine. So if you're going to use
Absolutely.
that term.
And I think that's exactly what should be done. The key is to really sort of make it accessible and make it something that is that also it reflects what's actually going on. I think Jeremy's paper on how the nose knows is really instrumental in that. This is how people shop now, ideally. I mean, this people we're talking about, but there are. Hang on, you answered something earlier. Oh yeah, so a couple of things though is that when you're processing it into like sort of the oils, you're really dehydrating it. You're driving out all the water as you can, and a lot of those esters are very water soluble. So if you actually if you've ever tried to condense the moisture that comes off of a drying cannabis plant, you will end up with some really interesting aromatics. So we did this, and I ended up with just this. It smelled like lilacs. It was incredible. All the water did, but I couldn't concentrate it because it was all so volatile. So I was a little, I was like, ah, damn it, I want to concentrate this, but I can't do it in a way that's going to make it stable. But then you also have the issues that the very lighter ones are going to be driven off and drive off over time. So one thing that I would suggest is that if you're trying to really capture those very early aromatics, try to figure out a much smaller serving size so that they're not opening and closing the vial all the time, because then they're going to be driving off of that aroma. So much smaller, like say, I mean, if you can even do a single use, that would be probably ideal if you can package it properly. But that's going to be kind of wasteful. But other ways of doing that, I think is really good. It could be a really useful approach.
I wonder, Nick, I loved when you were beginning to wax philosophic. And if I could actually go back to an earlier part of what you said, and if I could just take up a little bit of space to do some contextualization, I've been really having my mind bent in 3 different sensomic collaborations through my consultancy recently. I apologize, my voice is a little fucked. I've just gone through a 12-hour time change. But there's this really exciting frontier, obviously, in the metabolomics. And Ian, it's just been so wonderful to see all of the incredible work that you and the team have been doing. Always, I learn things from Mark, everything that you've shared over the years, and from a chemistry perspective. And Nick, of course, the great privilege of finding you after Rob and Mojave were like, look, go find the hops people. That's what matters. And really having my mind blown. Like these are things I obsess on. I really love metabolomics and chemistry. But in the sensomic space, I'm actually far more weighted on the sensory side right now, because what I believe is most relevant is contextualizing this whole dialogue. Like, okay, Marcus, this is a big show. Like, these are some incredibly intelligent folks. This is a really important subject. You've said this many times that the volatiles are a sort of vanguard of thought right now. But I want to suggest that it's like a revolution in what can happen between people and cannabis. That right now the industry is actually fucked in a variety of ways. And specifically, I want to talk about how consumers relate with the products from the perspective of indica sativa hybrid, wholesale prices, and I'm specifically talking about flower market globally, still correlating with THC potency above aroma character, systematic misinformation with regard to brands for strains, which do not capture meaningful sensory descriptions most of the time. Cereal milk could be an exception, but like in general, they really don't correlate. And then the average consumer, as I'm right now in Europe, watching this kind of like global enterprise be expanded from our California ideas, basically, and really in an outsized way, taking some of the worst ideas and doubling down. The average consumer walks in and has like an interaction with a pharmacist or a medical scene here, and they're hearing this heap of bullshit and lies. And then they're navigating this huge diversity of products, and they're absolutely dumbfounded, and they're not finding experiences that necessarily are what they like and resonate with, are also not finding the therapeutic and the wellness edges as a result. And I just want to suggest that as we progress this conversation, what's really at stake is disrupting all of this outmoded kind of prohibition era framing from a consumer perspective. And that getting volatiles right and getting sensory specifically right is a great threat to the old guard. There is not a more efficient path that I can find after more than 30 years working my ass off in this space to try to build a mass movement for consumer education where we get something like what Yakima Chief or what others in mature lateral industries have had for a long time. You get some kind of categories. And I've always thought of this as aroma types. that there is some kind of segmentation between the incredible amount of diversity of genetics and products that actually breaks down into something that's common sense. Because the fact is, nobody's buying wine based on thiol concentrations, even though they're incredibly important. Rarely people, although in some cases, are buying beer based on thiol concentrations. I think mainly people are thinking about a hazy IPA as opposed to a Pilsner. I think mainly people are thinking about a Cabernet Sauvignon as opposed to a Merlot. And those are radically different categories that are very deeply relevant and that serve this broad audience. So I just want to, like, outside of the amazing geekdom that we all love, try to paint that picture of, like, I think we're standing at the precipice of a fundamental reframing of the consumer experience that is a wellness experience that's contextualized in some kind of archetypal categorization based on sensory impressions and language. But I also want to be critical that the sensory language we've used is a bit ridiculous in many cases. I want to point specifically to published efforts in the last decade that have used a huge amount of adjectives that nobody I know or have ever known in cannabis use, that are really like florid, incredible, imaginative descriptors of what's possible from an aroma space, but it really generally statistically is not what's in common use and is more appropriate for more of us, innovators, scientists, and so forth. So I'm constantly obsessing on that consumer category. But if I could riff for one more wax philosophical, like, this is an extended rant. This is the big one that blew my mind. Why is it that sense of smell is so, like, beneath and behind all other senses? How did this come to be? Like, literally, people in a survey would chop off their finger, or in many cases, trade their iPhone for their sense of smell. The sense of smell is so unimportant. And this is like a remarkable thing that I think goes into a much bigger picture that ties back to where I am in Europe. In 1859, a conference happened that was the Society of Anthropology, and the scientist called Paul Brokaw came forward. And he demonstrated that there was a difference between humans and animals that was based on the massive front lobes in the brain. And this is the history. And I think this history is really, really important because it only very recently changed. But basically, for the last 150 years, there's been this hegemony and bias toward, like, humans in the hierarchy of nature being a superior animal. And how we've demonstrated that has been mainly about misunderstanding and pseudoscience when we look at olfactory capabilities. And so the fundamental thing that happened at this presentation was he presented this whole architecture that, like, literally for the last 156 years has still been greatly influential, to the point people will choose their cell phone over their sense of smell. And basically, this was really influenced by the church, by the fear of Darwin, by the fear that we were going to fall into atheism and materialism. And this is like classic, like, Trumpian science. This is like, it's the same theme. But here's what's wild. Just a few notes. I think this stuff is unbelievable. But the brains between human and animals weren't different, and the scientists then started to figure this out. The brains for the humans were massive, but the olfactory brain was exactly the same. There's 10 million neurons in the mouse olfaction, as well as 10 million neurons in the human olfaction. And it wasn't until basically in 2015 at a chemoreception sciences conference in Florida, this guy, Matthias Laska, who, Nick, I don't know if you're onto this guy. This was actually one of the most mind-blowing things I've seen in a while. He did a study where he looked at 20 species, and humans were included, and was looking at sensitivity to various odor molecules. At the end of it, there was a slide he presented that, like, dropped everybody's jaws, where humans were actually only bested by dogs in 5 of 15 molecules. Humans had better sense of smell than all other animals and species that were looked at. And in fact, we don't have a deficient sense of smell. And Nick, you've proven this to me a lot of times, Marshall as well. I wish Marshall was here. We have an incredibly acute, mind-blowing sense of smell. And I think people generally lean on this idea that it's connected with emotions and memories and all this unconscious stuff. And I think that's relevant and important. But I actually think it's more about beauty and the transcendent function and things that are vast and hard to describe. But back to this, like, presentation, there's actually in the human olfactory bulb, 1/10,000th of our total brain area is the olfactory bulb, and it's barely visible. But for a mouse, it's 2%. So the assumption was mice have a much stronger sense than humans because proportionally it's the same, even though we've now seen through Laska's work that basically in all mammals it's about the same. And really, it's wild that the rest of the brain has evolved so much that this olfaction evolutionary system is basically unchanged. Next, there was this common myth that humans could smell like 10,000 odors. That's been like a number that's been purported for a long, long time. Nick, I actually think you were the first person who were like, no, we need to talk upwards of trillions to really start to get into an accuracy. And the problem is we don't have language, as you were saying, to capture this incredible diversity of things. But the fact is, we still don't know how many odors that humans can smell, but the Rockefeller Institute did a huge evaluation of this a few years ago. And this is another amazing piece that came up, and I'm not going to be as cool as Mark and share the paper right now, but I can get some links. But basically, their estimate came up with 1 trillion based on using a set of 128 odor molecules in varying ratios and then floating that. And at the end of it, it was a mathematical model people are critical of. It's not, it's how do you quantify this trillion odor threshold? But bottom line is it's a lot. Next, there's this Nobel Prize called the EEG that's really amazing, where the Swedish researchers who won the EEG Nobel Prize, which is sort of like it has to make you laugh and then it has to make you think, is the sort of components of this particular aspect of the Nobel Prize. They demonstrated that these sommeliers were able to detect 1/1000th of a gram of a fruit fly pheromone in a single glass of wine. And so you could determine the sex of the fruit fly by their odor. And all of the sommeliers in the panel could detect an odor at that threshold, which would be similar to like the butyl mercaptan natural gas thresholds.
I know exactly what you're talking about, Jeremy. It's disgusting. I hate it.
It's yes, you don't want it, but it's 1/100000th of a gram of a fucking fruit fly, and universally the sommeliers could smell that. So again, we're incredibly sensitive in our sense of smell. But from basically 1890 or 1856 to 2015, there's this hegemony in science that suggests that humans can't smell that well, and it's not that interesting. And really, like, anyways, just move on. There's only a couple other points I want to make that I think are really important. There's a difference between taste and smell. In cannabis, I hear a lot about taste and flavor. Obviously, if you try to drink a cup of coffee when you're sick, like I am right now, it could taste like fizzy water. Or if you just have anybody, block their nostrils and then try to determine the difference between mustard and ketchup, you're really not going to be effective and determining that only through odor. But what's I think amazing is that humans have a unique function in sensory that's distinct from other animals, which is our retronasal capability. The orthonasal is how you smell, like sniffing, and you're sniffing things and it's coming in. Actually, that's what dogs are doing. But retronasal is coming, the flavor is perceived through the back of the throat. And so when we're chewing, things are being expressed, and it's a complicated, multifaceted way to perceive odor and is a human specialty. And I think that's really remarkable to note. But at the end, I think it's just important that smell is not just molecules. Smell is also not memories. Smell is an active creative process, and it impacts the brain. And back to the nose, the paper that I had worked on with Adi and team for years in this event called Cultivation Classic, it was very clear that this signal emerged from all the noise in our data that illustrated that the subjective pleasant effects of cannabis was driven not by THC potency, not by any other chemical threshold, but by the perception of aroma. And so I just think as we're working towards this kind of evolution in volatiles and things, that it can't be overstated that really, if we're more keenly sensitized and driven by our sensorial relationship with the product, we're going to be more obviously capable of deriving enjoyment and therefore finding wellness and therapeutic benefit. But I think also we're going to threaten the entire dogma and status quo of the existing cannabis marketing jargon and all the bullshit that stands in the way of a world and a new global audience actually having a meaningful relationship with this product that is revolutionary. And I'm super excited about all the science that's under the hood that is represented on this call that is powering that. I just want to also suggest that the sensory aspect is probably, from a consumer education side, really important, because I think I've made the mistake. I was the first dispensary in the US to put terpenes on the shelf with all of the products. I regret that now. The hegemony of terpenes followed the hegemony of THC, followed I mean, we've been really, chemo intensive. We've been focusing on these molecules. And I think it's really important. Like the work, Ian, you're doing and the work that teams are doing, it's revolutionary. But I want to suggest that even arguably in terms of global impact, the thing that's needed the most right now is actually simple sensory adjectives that connect with broad audience, that start to upset all of the existing status quo. Because the last thing I want to say, and thank you so much for this time, I really appreciate it, is basically that I think the greatest accomplishment of all the breeders I've known over the last 30 and 40 years is that this increasing complexity of volatiles has emerged. It's never been about potentiating THC. It's been little, and probably should have been more, about agronomic features. It's mostly been about sensory-driven expression. The greatest accomplishment of the underground cannabis movement to date, in my opinion, in terms of the development on the plant side, is simply this profusion of new components. I've grown numerous heirloom varieties from around the world, and there is very simple odor components relative to what's happening now with these massive structured profiles. And I think it's an incredible accomplishment. And I think all that gets undermined when we're not like focusing on this critical aspect of development. So just a bit of context. It's so awesome to get to be together.
Dude,
That's
first of all,
awesome.
oh yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Just to be quick, thank you, Jeremy. That's great. I wanted to jump onto that because a couple of things you said that were really important. One is, they're talking about that trillion odor options. A lot of that has to do probably with synergy and antagonism, is that we're able to detect a lot of things. And when these compounds work together, they create an entirely different experience for us. So it's like we're not, I mean, our noses are great GCs, but our minds are not great GC processors. So we have to assign them into these categories they're all experiential. They're all very emotional as well. That's why scents are really good at triggering emotions, but it's almost impossible to remember what something smelled like without having a formalized system. And you can describe it, but you're actually describing your experience of that thing. And so it's going to be, you can convey the ideas, but have you ever tried to explain a smell to someone or a scent to someone? It's very, very, very difficult unless you have a very, very strong shared common base from which to work, which is why I go on about, formalized sensory programs. Because, how can you describe the indescribable of, say, for me, I always use this example because I find it hilarious. Those really cheap sugar cones you got with like Carvel ice cream? Biting into one of those is like walking into my grandmother's house, because it has that contextual vanilla, kind of dusty, kind of cheap, kind of old lady aroma that seems to pervade a lot of grandmothers' houses for some reason. Maybe they have a potpourri that they all share. I don't know what it is, but that's sort of it's trying to figure out how to deal with those sensations and convey them to people. And then again, when you start looking, and you mentioned the sort of the land races that have, very relatively straightforward, fairly sort of simple, shall we say, aromatic or spectra in them. It's again, when you combine those with different genes from different regions, they will express you express things differently. And then you also end up with some really interesting interactions between these compounds, because you have a different metabolic pathway in one variety, or slightly modified metabolic pathway in one variety versus another. And so, but you've given it a whole host of new precursors. So it can be really, really interesting to see what happens. That's why I'm really excited about the metabolomic works that Ian's talking about.
Yeah, and guys, I think this is a perfect time. I have a few slides to kind of back this up. And I think this is awesome because it's all tied together. And I'm going to start with Mark. I'm going to quiz Mark real quick. So Mark, you're a chemist. I know Nick, you are as well. All of us probably have some chemistry background, but so let me ask you a question. Why is it that prenol, the same compound as prenylthiol, just an alcohol versus a thiol, why do you think that has a lower detection limit than the thiol does? Can you think of a mechanism for why sulfur specifically we seem to be so sensitive to sulfur? Do you have any sort of hypothesis why that might be? Think acid, hard, soft, acid-based chemistry.
I turn to just evolutionary pressure, right?
I'm talking about chemistry, Mark. I'm not talking about evolution. Do you want me to show the screen? I just want to see if you can come to this
Yeah.
conclusion, because it's super intuitive once you think about it and once you kind of see what they found.
Well, I know that, sulfur's got a different set of orbitals, right? So it's like
Yes.
it's a row down, right? So if you're talking about the chemistry, right? So it has an extra set of p orbitals, right? So it's based on what is it, neon, and then 2s2 2p4.
So can
I'm
you see
just
my
thinking about the
screen?
electronic configuration.
Can you
Yeah,
guys
we
see my
see it.
screen? All right.
Absolutely.
So let's dive into this. Okay. I thought this is just, I was just reading about this, just a few weeks ago. I think this is so fascinating because it's literally Gen Chem. It's hard, soft, acid based chemistry that's going on here. So sulfur is a soft, Lewis base. Alcohol containing species, oxygen, those are hard Lewis bases, right? And so there's this preference for the soft Lewis bases to want to go towards metals that are soft as well. Well,
Yeah,
guess
Ian,
what?
tell them what a Lewis base. These people don't know Lewis base and Lewis acid. Tell them what
You
that
you
is.
you explain that.
These
I'll get
people.
These people.
Whoa, that's
Well,
how they
no, no, no,
canceled
no.
Don Cherry.
I'm sorry. Never turn
I'm
down.
joking.
Never turn down an educational moment. I mean,
All
it's the
right.
one thing I learned
So
as a professor. You got to kind of start with the same set of
gotcha.
basis understanding. So Lewis acid. So Lewis was a chemist a long time ago, and what he figured out was that on a molecular scale, if things donate electron density, that's a Lewis base. If they accept electron density, that's a Lewis acid. So certain catalysts are Lewis acids because they accept electron density and that activates a molecule to do some chemistry. But in this case, we're talking about Lewis bases, not Lewis acids.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
And so this is so fascinating to me because it makes complete chemical intuitive sense, if you paid attention during this section of your general chemistry class or maybe inorganic chemistry class, that they've found that basically at least this human olfactory receptor, OR2T11, guess what atom is in there? A copper atom, which again has high affinity for sulfur. And so there is a very good chemical explanation for why, it's not just we know that it is, but why is it that way? Why is prenol not nearly as sensitive to our nose than prenolthiol? And so it's literally, in our receptors, we have these metal sites that these odorants can bind to, which then induces some sort of, structural change. It releases CAMP and you have downstream signaling from there. And our brain does all the complex, kind of interpretation of what that response was. And so anyway, I just thought this was so cool because it kind of gives like a real basic kind of chemical explanation for, at least in some cases, why certain odorants, specifically thiols in this case, and other VSCs, they found that other VSCs as well. I think I have some, yeah. So, I mean, this is beautiful work right here. This is so awesome. So this other paper was basically taking a whole bunch of different sulfur species, and then they used alcohol controls to basically see if there was a response from the receptor or not. And what you find is that, especially when they dump a little bit of excess copper into the assay, so you fill up all of these sites where this histidine, these two histidines kind of lock it in place in this protein. You see this response over time, and you can see that there's a varying level of that response depending on what it is. In fact, Jeremy, you just mentioned the T-butyl mercaptan, which is, I believe, what they put into natural gas. Look at that. That's what this top right guy is right here. And look at that response. It's massive. And so that guy is super sensitive to the human nose. And so now there's like receptor data backing up what people have known and why they added into natural gas. But I mean, I think even more fascinating about this is how, again, they use these alcohols as control, and there's almost no response.
No
You can see
response.
that
Yeah.
it's just fascinating. And, Mark, to me, this is so cool.
This is Eric Block at SUNY Buffalo.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
Eric has been doing this volatile sulfur research for, oh God, like 30 years, right? He's been at this for a while. Yeah.
And this is just
Great
beautiful, and it really gives me a better appreciation that, yes, a lot of smell, if from a kind of bigger point of view, is kind of esoteric, and it is hard to understand. I completely agree with what everybody's saying, but sometimes simple chemistry can almost explain why something might be happening, at least a little bit. And so I thought this was just really cool. This really kind of explained to me why sulfur species are so sensitive. And then Nick, you had mentioned, as well as Jeremy, this concept of how single compounds smell a certain way, but when you have binary mixtures and then more combinations of those, such as in cannabis where you literally have hundreds or hops, what have you, it's like its own thing, right? And so people have done some really awesome work on this just literally in like the last decade. So 2023, this paper came out 2020, so actually the last 5 years. And basically what they're showing is certain compounds can turn off the receptor response for others. And that makes sense, like that's obvious, but it's like there's data to back this up now. And it's really cool because this group showed in a complement mixture up to 12 odorants, so pretty simple. It's this antagonistic interaction. So you kind of turn off that receptor so it doesn't kind of fire. They're stronger, more prevalent with increasing mixture complexity. That to me is fascinating. So, Jeremy, what you were saying about like it's there's a lot going on here. It's like, yes, there is. Mechanistically, there is so much going on. Like we're like this compound's turning this off, this is turning that off, or maybe these things together combine to turn things on. And now you start to see just how it's like so damn complicated. But I thought that this last statement is just really interesting. Therefore, antagonism is a common feature of odor mixture and coating and helps in normalizing activity to reduce saturation and increase information transfer. In other words, our nostrils are basically adapting to bring as much information to the brain as possible. And it's like nature's incredible. Like that to me is just such an incredible thing that our noses are doing on a constant basis. Nick, what's up? I saw you.
Ian, it's really interesting like that because you get also odorant saturation curves
Exactly.
for people, and so what you can do is like some of them are so strong they block everything else out. That's frequent with some of the very, very strong thiols, and that's the signal is so they're probably just binding to a lot more sites in our odor receptors, and it's just blowing the signal out of the water.
Yep.
But with H2S, for example, is a really good example. We're very sensitive to it in the beginning, but we quickly then can relegate it down to a baseline layer, and then we can smell things on the sort of other side of that layer. So we can actually start perceiving some of the other compounds that are interacting with our olfactory sensors. And so what we're seeing then is that we are tuning our response to be able to then pay attention to these other signals that are coming in. And this makes perfect sense because also when you have a huge number of complex compounds together, you might just have the signal to noise ratio might be very poor, meaning that we're just getting so much thrown at us that all of our receptors are triggering into all these different things. We can't really pull it apart, and that takes training. And that's so I think this is really fascinating stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll show one example because I think this is just so cool. And like this could be a business idea because methane thiol is definitely a nuisance odor. But this other group showed this really cool work that so beta ionone, which is the chemical shown here on the bottom left, but this compound actually can reduce at least the perception of the methane thiol, which is it has this nasty kind of sewer rotten cabbage fecal kind of smell. It's gross. So generally speaking, you don't really want methane thiol around. But what was fascinating about it, and to go to Jeremy's point as well as Nick's point about it's important to have a trained sensory panel to be able to quantify this sort of thing. They were able to basically just do a normal panel on methane thiol, but when they do it in combination with the beta ionone, it was much more suppressed. And that's awesome from the sensory standpoint. But what was really cool, they showed that beta ionone is an antagonist for the methane thiol. So whatever receptor that is, they saw a reduced firing of that. So there is a mechanistic underpinning here. It's not just everything's going on. It's like there's a reason for this. Yeah,
probably does a Michael addition. It Michael adds across that double bond, and now you have a different sulfur compound.
I don't think it's that, Mark. I'll send you the paper. Yeah. I think it's literally the beta ionone in combination. It acts as an antagonist, so the methane thiol cannot bind to the receptor quite as strongly as it typically would. That sort of thing. But
it's sort of like an active site like product and substrate inhibition.
Exactly.
Very similar.
Yeah, precisely.
And so that's a pretty compelling theory. I'd like to see someone prove that, but it makes sense sort of intuitively.
Yeah. And then I have one
beta
other
ionone's
thing.
A good Michael acceptor, and methane thiol is a good nucleophile.
Yeah.
The question is not why will they react? We know the answer to that. Why
Mhm.
don't they react? That's the question asked.
Right. And then the other thing I'll just mention for all you cannabis extractors and processors out there, beta ionone is a decomposition product of beta carotene.
Yeah.
And beta carotene is definitely in cannabis. I was just working with Alex Siegel. He's a guy who does a ton of extraction here in SoCal, and he had run a huge column on a bunch of HTE, live resin, and he was able to isolate this dark orange fraction. And interestingly, it smelled sort of rosy, sort of kind of like that, what you would expect beta ionone to have. And so we ran that fraction on the GC, we saw it, and then yeah, it had a ton of the beta carotene in there. So the point being is that these compounds in cannabis that don't necessarily have a smell by themselves, if they decompose, they can definitely produce those. And somebody had mentioned that earlier, that it's I think it was Colin, you mentioned that during the hash making process, it's kind of like Nick, this sort of a survivable compounds concept in brewing. It's almost like the same thing, but in processing of cannabis, where you have something that's benign odor, from an odor perspective early on, but if it's processed incorrectly, or maybe something happens to it, exposed to the wrong sort of environment, you can start to bring in compounds that, hey, maybe that's good, right? I'm not, beta ionone isn't, it's used in perfume, it's used in tons of kind of industries where odors, that sort of rosy violet aroma is necessary. But yeah, I just thought this work was so cool, because it's kind of bridging kind of the mystery of how all this kind of fits together into an actual understanding on the, at least the receptor sort of layer. What happens between the receptor and the middle of my brain, I have no idea. That's kind of like the big mystery, I think, for all of humanity to figure out. But definitely really interesting stuff.
Ian, I just thought of one other
ahead,
quick
please.
mystery. Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
I loved that mystery. I was also thinking, there's this fantastic book I've been reading by a guy named Luca Turin, who maybe you've heard of. He's a perfumer, and he starts speculating about how all of these different movements in science have tried to correlate molecular structure with perceived aromatics, and how that really has largely not worked. And then he gets into the very contentious theory around waves, molecular waves.
Oh
And
yeah, I've seen that.
and then I was just thinking of this. I don't know if you guys know the two slit experiment in
The
quantum.
double slit
Yeah,
experiment.
the double slit, which is
Yeah.
one of my absolutely favorite bits. But I opened up Instagram this morning and I saw this meme and I was so happy, because I'm fascinated about, like, for anybody who doesn't know, basically they were shooting electrons with a particle accelerator through two slits. Remarkably, in the top, and this is an actual experiment that's been reproduced in several locations, and arguably is one of the most interesting quantum science experiments and demonstrations as we talk about quantum biology, which has to be part of the aroma conversation. In the top, there's numerous distributions. And as soon as the scientist observes the behavior of these particles, then it organizes neatly into two groups, demonstrating this really remarkable behavior
Right.
in
Yeah.
these
Yeah. It's like
complex systems.
the superpositions collapse basically once you try to
Exactly.
observe them. Yeah. Right.
I'm
And
fascinated
observation
about
can be
both
just
in
measurement as well. It's not just
Exactly.
humans observing; it can actually be measurement. Any sort of
Yep.
quote unquote observation.
I think unless we bring in full quantum biological perspectives, we're unlikely to achieve the kind of sophistication and accuracy in describing molecular expression of aromatics with the perceived expression
So,
that
so
we either see or don't see, or smell or don't smell. In any case,
Yeah. And people, it's so fascinating, Jeremy, because this concept of, basically the concept is, different compounds have different vibrational modes, right? That's those modes are quantum by nature, right? They're dictated by the structure, and that they follow rules, the symmetry rules and whatnot. And they're all unique technically. But what I saw people had done, I was thinking of putting this in, but I thought it was, I didn't want to have too many slides. But people have taken odorants and then they deuterate them. And so all you're doing is you're taking the hydrogen atoms on that molecule and replacing them with deuterium. Well, deuterium, that in theory is the same compound. The only difference is you have, it's structurally going to be very similar. I see you're shaking your head, Nick. But what does change a bunch from that are the vibrational modes, because deuterium is now twice as heavy because of that extra neutron. So the point is when they did this, they introduced it to rats what they found is that they could differentiate these two things. And I think this is kind of leading towards, you might be right, Jeremy, that vibrational modes do have an effect, which again, that's an effect of quantum mechanics, right? Everything's vibrating at room temperature, above absolute zero. And so I think it's just, yeah, like that concept is so interesting to me. And so I would love, in fact, I need to write a grant to get this sort of money. I would love to deuterate the prenylthiol, that's the main gas compound in cannabis, and see if it smells different, because that's never been done before. But man, that would be so fun to do, and verify if I can tell, like, oh yeah, that's slightly different from what the the actual one is found in nature. But yeah, no, that theory is very, I saw it's controversial, but I don't know. It seems like there's a little bit of data to kind of back it up, which is pretty wild.
Ian, it's interesting just to think about that also from the perspective of handedness of molecules, just the different chiralities.
Right.
We're going to see some very different, we'll probably see some very different responses to the L and D forms, for example. On the rose note, on the ionone, in terms of the opposition here of being an antagonist to methane thiol, if you mix beta ionone and phenylethyl alcohol together,
yeah,
you get the most intense rose scent, and it's significantly more than the combination of the two in terms of intensities. So it's really, really interesting to look at that.
Yeah, Nick, that's kind of what this graph up on the bottom is showing, that synergy can amplify, whereas some things can suppress. Yeah, so
yep.
I mean, that makes total sense to me. Yeah. Very cool. I think, yeah, that was basically it for this kind of the mechanistic background behind kind of how we're smelling some of these compounds. But man, you chimed in earlier. Did you have any comments or questions?
I've just loved the conversation. I've been so aching for this conversation for so long that I've almost had a hard time putting my thoughts into words. I definitely really appreciated Jeremy's talk, his brief breakdown, and it just got me thinking. I always, okay, so first of all, I have an extremely sensitive olfactory. I've had it my entire life, and I guess I've looked at it kind of as my superpower, especially in cannabis, because it was so advantageous to be able to perceive aromas that maybe others couldn't perceive, even the negative ones, molds or something that's off, or I would smell it way before. I'll never forget smelling, funny enough, sulfur sprayed for powdery mildew at the Compassion Club on their flower, and I smelled a half pound. This was back in the 90s when really people didn't know. I had discovered this by making bubble out of some sulfurated product, and it basically, when I lit it with a match, it smelled like a match. When I lit it with a lighter, it smelled like a pack of matches being blown off at once. And I'll never forget, it was 20 grams of full melt 6-star Rene bubble, and I hucked it into the forest. I was just like, I just didn't even want to eat it, or I was just like, you have to go. But what I would say is that I've always seen my olfactory as a bit of a superpower, even though I've always said, and people that know me, I've always said this, there's a lot more bad smells in the world than there are good smells. There is this sort of, maybe it's flaky, but this sort of, to me, smell is one of the oldest languages. Right? This is a language of communication and unraveling and understanding. And through my sense of smell, I have been able to better perceive the world than I would without it. That's why I could never imagine. I'd probably trade both my hands for my olfactory. My olfactory is extremely important to me. And while Jeremy was talking, I just, I saw this sort of, is there a Tower of Babel, metaphorically, to cut people's olfactory off so they can perceive less of the world and figure out and understand less of these rabbit holes that you can go down. I've always seen my olfactory as extremely important. When I first met Nick and he started talking about sensory science and explaining these blind spots and these sensitivities, I was just so fascinated by it because I've lived with it for my entire life. My wife only had a inkling of what I lived with when she was pregnant 3 times. Her sense of smell, which is also interesting. Why would your sense of smell become super sensitive when you're pregnant? What's that about? What are you perceiving and learning through this nose that you don't even know that you're learning? So that was kind of my thought, that there's maybe, I always knew that tobacco, cigarettes were a way to blow out your olfactory. People that stop smoking after a couple months have often said to me, holy smokes, can I smell? I had no idea strawberries smelled as good as they smelled. I had a strawberry the other day and I held it under my nose for half a second, and I'm like, yeah, man, you're missing out on the world. Like, stop destroying your olfactory. So yeah, I'm just excited to learn today and have my brain tickled in different ways. And you guys are all doing that. So thank you.
Marcus, a couple of bits. I loved when you get to the like Tower of Babel and like this kind of, what are these fundamental architectures that stand in the way of the direct experience that you've embraced and that we found? And I so relate with what you say. I think one of the reasons I have been successful as a producer has a lot to do with my passion and obsession with sensory dynamics in cultivation. And that really has absolutely driven me. That's why I made less money than anybody I ever taught to grow, because I would go through so many diverse varieties and cultivars because I wanted to smell them all. And I wanted to try and change things and try to produce different smells. But one quick bit more on the Tower of Babel that I dropped earlier. Back to Paul Brokaw, the world was divided between osmotic and anismatic species. This was the first idea in the evolution of science in Western Europe. The osmotic were these animals that could like be driven by smell. Their brain was principally devoted to smell. And from an evolutionary perspective, this is about how do we find food? And this is this lower function. It's associated with bestiality, the nixth of us and so forth, doing this bestial task. I love that with your beard, Nick. I'm sorry. Anyways, the anismatic, though, are the humans and a few other species that are at this higher order of function, that are, driven by reflection and thought and imagination and creativity. And that's the beginning. It actually evolves from there to absolute bullshit pseudoscience, which then breaks down people into having greater or lesser smell. And this was really a racist trope that basically exalted Western Europeans as being more anismatic than non-Western European cultures that were still cultures that were related to olfaction and to sensory experience. And then it's only back lastly to that 2015 paper where all of a sudden all that's blown up and it's like, no, humans have this unbelievable sense of smell. But I think one other thing that is fascinating that we've all gone through is COVID. During COVID, however many millions of people experienced a direct loss of perception of olfaction, which I've gone through. I had COVID way too many times. Bottom line is, I did two different instances lose for at least 48 hours completely my ability to perceive things. That was truly terrifying. There was this feeling of this could last. This is my career. This is my love in life. This is my raison d'etre. Like, I can't go without this. And I think that struck a chord in a lot of people. And suddenly the importance of sensory is actually on the uptick in part because of being sort of confronted with the possibility of loss. And but there's even a little bit more, which is, I think, reclaiming, outside of what was clear religious influence, which was an oppressive perspective that was very intentionally sown to kind of separate humans from an evolutionary perspective from animals due to the shock waves from Darwin's On Origin of Species, which really, it all has to do with this reaction and backlash to that. In a sense, at the beginning, I think, there really was this notion of that's going to blow up the theology, all the dogma that stands in the way of that. And I think we're still living through the ripples following that. And it's a radical act to really be driven by your senses and to perceive them. And then back to sensory expression, to be able to articulate them effectively in a way that's meaningful. I really quickly, could just one bit on agronomy. Nick, you brought up the contribution of gypsum. So I think about a world where volatiles are really important and the various contributing factors. Of course, we do, especially in organic farming, introduce a lot of gypsum. But one of the little known facts is that organic matter, which takes, an evolutionary period of time, like geological time, to really produce organic matter, not active organic matter, is a source of leaching sulfur. It's not just phosphorus. It's actually this sulfur is in high titer in most organic matter. And so if you're farming in a region and you're like at field scale cultivation that has low soil organic matter, you're definitely getting a reduced sulfur profile in that cultivation area. And I think that's fascinating. But then a couple other practical things. If volatiles matter from a producer's perspective, how would you reframe all of the things you do from breeding and selection of plants to cultivation of plants to harvest and post-harvest methods to wholesale to retail to packaging to sensory experiences at the consumer level? I think I feel like we've been trying to disrupt this for a long time, but every single one of those things changes if this becomes your priority. Every single one, and where the craft lives most richly is in innovations that address means of harnessing and sustaining and creating stability in the volatile expressions, which means everything was fucking built wrong. We still have flowers that are like, 2 years old on retail shelves in Oregon. There's still like this kind of stuff. It's just volatiles are not are not parallel with quality, and quality is the incorrect word, as Nick has pointed out in the past. Character. Character is really the most meaningful descriptor. It's the sense of if product character is ascribed to value, and the value of the product really is a lot about how much character is there, and is it desirable character? Is it hedonic character? Then we would do everything differently than currently happens. So I've been really excited about exploring innovations in each area, especially emphasizing harvest and post-harvest, but also working intensely in agronomy. And this has been my primary forum in the last, like, especially 3 years. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited about finding the ability to harness commercial scale expression of these innovative practices, but the world still doesn't care. People still don't understand these distinguishing variables, and it's
Not yet, Jeremy,
maddening.
not yet. But you're what I think what you're touching on is really important because, when you're commercializing these compounds, it takes a certain set of parameters and SOPs to follow. And you have to, through the whole process, and it's a linear process in some respect, you have to be very careful about what intentions and the things that you're doing throughout that processes that you have. And if you're not really careful throughout the process, agronomy is a great example, all the way to your harvest timing, as someone mentioned earlier in the conversation, as to when are you actually harvesting that said cultivar, for what reasons, and what chemical constituents are making up why, and how, and where, and the environment, such as when, and then it goes into this idea of drying, right? We have this conceptual idea of like, we're drying a product. Well, we're are we we're trying to cure a product, and depending on what your end goal is, is it going to be jarred, is it going to be frozen? There are different decisions you have to make. So I think back to the volatile aspect of it, these matter because the consumer is after these fleeting moments that draw us all in, which are all tied to aromatics. These things are much like harmonics. They come in and perfectly lock in and then dissipate. And if you're not careful, they dissipate sometimes much faster. So, in the spirit and the pursuit of holding space for aromatics, you have to really pay attention through the processing of what you're doing when you're not only cultivating, but also processing through into whatever it might be. So, it's super important that you do say these things, Jeremy. It really is, because people need to hear this, because you're doing it at scale, right? Much like most of us on this panel here. And it's not easy. There's choices, and you're faced with really hard decisions often, so, and I know, abstract, and you're working with your team. When I was at PAX Labs, we did a lot of really intricate things that I think were really groundbreaking at the time, to be honest. I don't think, like the sleep formula, I think was a great example. I think, there's just looking at the aromatic, space and in general, and, there's certain decisions you have to make, and working, seeing behind the scenes a little deeper into the curtain as to what you do, to tell the consumer or the the viewers out there, there's extremely intricate chemistry going on when you're sitting down with a group like Abstract. It is beyond extensive, and it's in some case experimental, and that's where you find the magic in the mundane. So, I commend everything that you're saying, Jeremy and Ian, and obviously Nick. Your experience has just been so incredible. I know
Colin,
I learned a
also,
lot.
I think about what you've done and what Marcus has done and all the hash makers. I think about there's a multi-thousand-year hash making tradition, which is the cannabis tradition until very, very recently. Like flower wasn't a thing. It was never a thing. And I just think a lot of people lose that historical context. But similarly, the hash you make is not the hash that was made before. And the key differentiating point from my perspective is simply that you are harnessing far greater volatile content. You're creating something that is emulating the original plant's phytochemical inventory. And that aromatic profile is certainly not going to be present in the same way in like some 6-star bubble hash that's like absolutely an incredible legendary variety grown well. Compared to dry sift from field scale Moroccan production. It's just that I think there's been this line in the sand that then when flower comes into the conversation drives this interest in freshness. And I think
Sure.
freshness is defined better in other spaces. And Nick, another thing you taught me is just simply that notion on the, I can't remember what it's called, something hop freshness index or an
Hop storage
indices that
index, yeah.
hop storage index. So greater than 50% loss of the original aromatic content would indicate that that product is spoiled. There's something to that effect. And like, if back to what you said, Colin, with drying, I did that study with Ethan on cryokeef, and we were able to systematically show that we absolutely, in our best case scenario, and I'm talking about giant budgets with like
Yeah.
10 drying environments, each with 2 HVAC systems, with like very tight 3D projected fucking Bluetooth sensor networks that were managing microclimates. Like we did the best version of drying I've seen. We still had a greater than 50% loss of original, just looking at monoterpenes, nothing volatiles. And so there's just fundamentally, it's like it's broken from a freshness perspective. And in fact, the only examples that currently are consumer facing that are, at least from the plant-based perspective, that are demonstrations of freshness are what you make. It's these beautiful like hashes that are refrigerated, that have stability. And when people first saw batters that were remarkable and so forth, like that's the beginning of the conversation. But now I sort of want that premium craft pinnacle product to drag everything else toward freshness. And like when I think about yeah, exactly, look at the glistening, juiciest luster. How can you not
Jeremy,
like
one
like this is
one
also
thought
what yeah, please.
one thought on the drying, I thought about this a lot over the past 3 years of freeze drying. I feel like there's got to be a better way than freeze drying. There has to be, because I feel like that in and of itself is we're not actually representing what we're after. We're doing a great job of getting a commercial product to market, but from an aromatic point of view, we're ripping all this awesome stuff away that I want to keep.
Yeah,
Right.
hear
And
you, hear you.
we're getting close, and we collect data, and we're able to, use lab concos and all these other great tools to, as we're getting down in vacuum, we're adjusting, we're not just letting it rip down to 0 millitorr. But with that said, as everyone's shaking their head, we're just ripping a lot of important things away from this material that are very therapeutic, very important to the experience, and the associations sometimes to these whole plant profiles. So,
Hey,
just leaving
Colin, one
to
quick,
kind
I
of
just
talk
want to say,
about here, but I'll
I
leave it
know
there.
you've been down this wormhole and we all have. I just think there's freeze drying and then there's freeze drying. And the reality is,
Sure.
there are things I'm not privy to talk about that I can only indicate towards. I know as Ian sits on a treasure trove of unpublished science, I've got some also, and I can't wait until I can actually talk about it more. But I will say that I have now observed a freeze-dried flower product that absolutely boggles my mind in terms of preservation of the original aromatics. And so I feel absolutely convinced that I will never hang dry any botanical material for the rest of my life if I have my druthers. Nobody will make me, if nobody can drag me into that equation. and that there is a really beautiful forward path that, in fact, is more cost effective, has a far better stability, has far better, if you look at every dynamic, especially from a volatile perspective, but even down to microbiology, we finally have a revolution happening in our post-harvest methodology. It's just that it's still not widespread, and the majority of what people have been exposed to sucks. And now judgments are formed, similar to when supercritical fluid extraction came forward, and people are doing it for a bulk cannabinoid process, and they're not looking at subcritical, and they're not doing these incredible techniques that clearly were massively differentiated from a volatile perspective. And now everybody thinks CO2 sucks, and they would prefer to have BHO.
They were making doo-doo butter.
Yes, and now there's this brand associated with it. It's like a global consumer perception, and unfortunately, it's totally unfounded on early poor applications of the technology I've seen. Anyways, but back to, I think the hash makers are actually leading this whole conversation from a quality perspective, from a consumer angle. I don't think people who haven't been exposed to the kind of quality of product that you guys are making, they don't, if they're not breeders or growers, they don't know, they or unless they're, somebody in our friend group that's at this like elite echelon of people that get to really see the incredible diversity and intensity of whole plant aromatic contributions. So I'm excited for more people to discover that, and I'm also excited to do that. Back to one thing I just think about, Ian, with conversation with you, is sort of like, there's plant derived components, there's not non-plant derived components, and the reality is, I think right now there's also a hell of a dogma about things that are natural versus not natural. And I've been really steeped in the perfume world recently, because I think I learned early on that basically cannabis science is like down here, hops was up here, wine is up there, and perfume was kind of in this rarefied world of volatiles and aromatic understandings and insights. And now I can see examples of like better toxicity profiles, for example, and some synthetic components, a variety of things. It's a complicated foray, but I just want to say that I think that obviously the vapable products and things that abstracts and that true terpenes and that other teams have been powering are like having massive consumer forums, and they're very poorly understood. But I think that's the other exciting spot. But there's this part of me that, my job at True Terpenes is really to create the plants and the processes and the systems to do the plant-derived component and path. And that's very intensely what I'm working on. But I also revere the non-plant derived path. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. And it's a complicated foray, but I love the hash. I'm trying to get back to Marcus. Thank you for holding this torch in the dark night of the conversation around product character, led by these value-added products that were passionately produced at incredible loss with tiny yields that demonstrated the potential that can radiate to all facets of the space.
Yeah, Jeremy. Yeah. So this is awesome. What you just mentioned, and Colin, you as well, about, that process between growth, drying, curing, that kind of that I would argue is the most important step, because you can have something that smells amazing up until then, and you can just ruin it within a few days, maybe even a few hours if you're not doing it right. But Jeremy, you're talking about the freeze drying stuff, and yeah, some of the new work that we're doing right now, which again hopefully is published before the end of the year, I'll say, moisture I think is implicated in those compounds. And so everybody looks at moisture, I feel, as this sort of, oh yeah, you got to get rid of it, you got to get it to these right levels and you're good. I think there's much more to it than that, based on the new chemistry that we know, because some of these compounds are water soluble. So let me tell you guys something. I'm probably giving away too much here, but this is the biggest application of this new knowledge we have. Do any of you guys make ice hash rosin?
I've been known to dabble.
Okay, great.
This is hash church, bro.
Yeah. I figured, and people in the audience, I'm sure too. So you're gonna love this. All right. Well, I don't know if you'll love it. Okay, so what we found is that some of these precursor molecules are water soluble. you guys probably can already tell where I'm going with this conversation. If you make ice water hash, you are losing those water soluble compounds to the water. We have verified this. We have taken a chemical reagent that can unlock these compounds and volatilize them. And you can just to your nose smell an incredible burst of gas, the skunk. I mean, in fact, the levels are so high. We were talking, Nick, about, typically cannabis kind of lays in this regime where it's just gassy. When you unlock all these compounds synthetically, like we did just as an experiment, it was rubber, it was burnt. So what I'm saying is that cannabis has these things stored in huge quantities, massive quantities. And so if you're making ice hash rosin, you are losing some of these potential compounds that might be useful in the actual hash to the water phase. And so somebody had mentioned the esters being water soluble. I think it was you, Nick, had mentioned the esters are more water soluble. So we had got a bottle. After we'd kind of worked out some of this chemistry, I'd asked somebody to procure a bottle of just the water from a hash from a producer here in LA. And so they sent us a bottle of it. It smelled amazing. And Nick, it smelled like fresh flower, young fresh flower. And I'm convinced it's because of those. It's more rich in the more water soluble compounds, aka the esters, those sort of things. It was really gassy too. But again, you add this reagent, it explodes in smell. And so my point is we're so early on in all this research. We need to go to different varieties, and we've done a few, and it's really interesting work across varieties how these are stored or not. But it makes me wonder if could we breed for, or and nobody likes this word GMO, edit in something, but if we can identify what is it that produces these precursors, and then also figure out how are they released, because that's the other part of the equation. What we found is that these things exist in these bound states, and as Nick knows, in the hop world, they're non-volatile, they don't smell, they don't contribute much to aroma or flavor. They're essentially inactive. But over time, things change, they off gas, blah, blah, blah. And so we're going to be doing a time-dependent study just, on looking at all these volatiles, and, the precursors and then the volatiles that we see, instead of using a synthetic reagent like we did. But, oh man, I think it's going to change how we approach so much, because it's going to be mind blowing. It was mind blowing for me, and for you guys who make hash, I can guarantee you're going to love it. So,
Ian, I love your passion. And I just quickly wanted to mention, I don't know if you saw it, Ethan Russo had this notion a while back, and I supported him in the publication of a paper called Cryokeef, that basically we demonstrated the loss of some of the water soluble components.
awesome.
Cryokeef truly captures those components. It has a lower yield, but I would say is an evolution in terms of being able to harness a broader cross section of the original volatiles. But one other quick thing on the production side, I've been doing a lot of organic commercial scale farming because I'm just from an ecological, a cost perspective and effectiveness over time perspective, I've after leading lots of agriculture programs, just committed at this point to organic crop production. And one of the most fascinating pieces finally just got published. Nick, we've talked about this in the past, but people have only speculated. But now there is a publication that at least starts to lay the framework for looking at how endophytes, so intracellular organisms that are definitely upregulating aroma synthase and playing a significant role outside of like conventional agronomic perspectives. The soil biology and rhizosphere dynamics with all of these different species are certainly playing a significant role. And I believe one of the things that I've been perceiving just from a sensory perspective, doing field sensory in various cultivation regions, is the role of endophytic organisms, because obviously climate is a massive complex variable, agronomy is a massive complex variable, but I've had the privilege of producing the exact same varieties that have incredible stability in various regions. And one thing I'll say is that when I have a really rich organic crop producing strategy, I'm just simply observing a far more chemo-diverse profile, something that has a lot of nuance and subtlety that I'm not seeing in the controlled environment production where I was using a more limited program. But I think that's one of the many things that, from an agronomic perspective, are going to be a core source of innovation. You can absolutely impact the endophytic populations based on your cultivation strategies. I remember one thing we were doing in Yakima, which I was excited about. Well, Yakima has actually relatively poor soil. Sorry, it's really pretty like they're farming down to the bones of the earth with conventional crop producing practices. There's lots of rubble in the field. There's like this thin calcitic. Anyways, we brought in a lot of endomycorrhizae, and I mean a shit ton, and that was an exciting beginning in that path. But I'm now working with actually the world's largest commercial organic farmer, which is based in Colombia, and they've been for many generations working outside of US agrochemical companies to innovate and really build this kind of active organic matter with the existing really high levels of organic matter. And I'm seeing things that are like, I don't think I'll ever farm in the US again, honestly. I think it's done. I'm throwing in the towel. I've been swimming upstream my whole life. Organic crop production is like less than 1% of cultivation in the US. There is a bunch of shitty farming going on. It's incredibly efficient. It's everything else. But back to our subject, it's just not where the goods are. Anyways, I'll stop there. That's a pretty extreme statement.
Jeremy, you and I have talked about this before, but yeah, feed the bugs, and feed the microbes, and they will do interesting things. The work that's coming out on endophytic microbes is really, really interesting, particularly because you can also see it on actually the surface of the plants as well. Like certain microbial species will actually induce pretty severe changes, sometimes through a stress response, other times through, I think, possibly direct interaction with precursor compounds. And I'm wondering how much of the sort of release of aromas and the change in aromas is due to those endophytic microbes and the bacteria acting on the compounds that are already in the plant. And as we've been finding for decades now, plants will sort of exude a certain set of compounds for beneficial bacteria, and like in the rhizosphere specifically, there's a species of maize that actually drips down a syrup of sugar, salts, and amino acids that actually feeds the soil bacteria, so it actually generates its own nitrogen. It's really, really cool. There's a lot of this stuff going on. And
Nick, one quick thing though,
Shoot.
what you're describing is very much outside of, back to Ian, when you talk about GMO, I just think about quickly this contrast where I'm now been exposed to multiple programs that are upwards of $50 million CapEx investments now on the genetics side to innovate in ways that have actually, I'll just say for the most part, been pretty underwhelming in terms of the kinds of results that I see in practice. Where on the other side, things like let's nourish this kind of feed the bugs perspective. Let's work on endophytes. Let's work on a vast array of cultural practices that with this incredible diversity of genetics that are now available, are able to immediately change the expression of the volatiles and the overall sensory character in a way that's significant with a very tiny budget, with just some design of experiment, some repetitions, some analytical testing budgets, and just field sensory. And I just think it's fascinating. Like here we have this like incredibly phenotypic plastic plant that basically just transforming constantly whenever we go in a direction. I haven't found a really compelling argument for any of the kind of gene knockout at this point based on the innovations that we're seeing. On the other hand, I'm not all opposed. It's just not been needed.
And Jeremy, I mean, I personally think that the reason that we haven't seen the gains necessarily from that sort of perspective is, have we been looking for the right targets? I mean, you look, Nick, I'm sure you know this. Terpene profiles can look very, very similar in hops, in cannabis. Yet if the underlying chemistry of basically everything else is different, that's where your aromatic diversity comes from. I've seen this all the time. I remember a breeder, I think it was, I don't remember his capulator maybe, but one of these guys had sent some to Masonic, Masonic Smoker, to taste test two varieties. And he put out this on Instagram where he was basically being like, I got these tested at a testing lab for terpenes. They look identical, yet Masonic's like, I love this one, I hate that one. So there has to be more to the story. And I mean, that's all the research that we've done. That's what Nick was doing at Yakima Chief, showing that, hey, it's these really minor components that are driving these things. And so my point being is, if we don't even if we haven't known what the minors are, how do we know where to look? Because the biosynthetic pathway may be completely different. It may not be made de novo. It may be made when the plant's stressed. And in fact, going back to kind of what we're going to be releasing here in the future, I actually think that what we're going to find is that these precursor molecules are implicated in stress response for a good reason. And that's obvious, but what it's tethered to, it really is going to open up, I think, everybody's mind to like, okay, now that we know this is in there and maybe how it evolves during plant growth, let's try stressing it in different ways, and people do this anyway, right? I know that you've probably done stress trials, Jeremy, just to see how different conditions affect it. But now we can actually monitor some of these compounds that might be kind of actually maybe releasing things under certain stress, maybe accumulating under certain stress. Maybe you can accumulate and then release later, right? I mean, that's the sort of ideas I'm thinking about, where it's like, oh shit, not just a linear sort of application of this, but it's like you can dynamically change the metabolic redox processes that are occurring in the plant, just through environmental stress or what have you. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Two points on that. Sorry, can I jump in quickly before I forget? 2 points on that. One is, plants produce things for a very specific reason. And there's two mechanisms for doing that. One is, especially in response to stress, for example, they'll produce something. And when we talk about the endophytes, it'd be really interesting to see that, if the microbes are living inside the plant and it's providing a commensal or beneficial relationship, they're going to feed them. And so I'm wondering how much of the stress response is actually the plant providing these organisms with precursors to help fight off a potential predator or attract
super
a predator.
Yeah, so it's almost like a symbiotic relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's super cool.
One quick note was that the highest total terpene inventory that I ever saw out of 48 crops a year for 6 years at Proof with constant chemotypic data was when we had rice root aphid pressure early on, and I was working to eradicate that. There's no question that of all the stressors I've explored, this is one thing that you can share openly. It's a stressor you cannot control, but the rice root aphid pressure at a very high level of pressure was able to produce a shocking amount of monoterpenes. We had a plant that tested at 8% by dry weight total terpene content. And in any case, really quickly, I just want to acknowledge, Mojave, brother, it's really good to see you. And I think you missed in the beginning something that was really sweet, which was that, Marcus was talking about how Nick was really the first person to bring forward the notion of thiols and thiolates. And I was thinking back to a beer that I was having with you and Rob, and how really, I think this conversation wouldn't have taken the shape that it is, wouldn't even be happening maybe in the same way had it not been for you guys mentoring and really inspiring this whole dynamic. And really, it was quite a long time ago now. I mean, it's been a long time. You're like, go to the hops scientists. And then I'm listening voraciously to all these hops podcasts. And then Nick emerges to be this towering intellect. I'm just like, Jesus Christ, this guy's fucking insane. Gotta find this guy. And, I find a handful of other kind of whack jobs that are way in the deep end, but Nick was the most fun. In any case, but then the introduction between Marcus and Nick, and then these characters, and then later Ian, your publications, this whole conversation. But I just give you so much credit, brother. It's so wonderful thinking back to that inspiration, and just for all the ways that you've continued to give thought and form and love to this ongoing intellectual pursuit of trying to better the plant and our relationship with it. It's just wonderful. It's good to see you. And also, I apologize, but I'm in Europe and I'm going to break for dinner in 20 minutes because I've eaten very little and am low blood sugar, and I have about 20 more minutes in me.
That's awesome. Hey, thank you, Jeremy. It's great to see you, and it's great to see all you guys together. About 20 years ago, I remember just thinking about cannabis aroma and just thinking, obviously, Rob imparted me this gift of terpene knowledge before I came back to California from Amsterdam. And so in California at the point was a blank slate, and no one knew what terpenes or a lot of different aspects of cannabis aroma. And anyway, I remember diving into what is cannabis aroma about 20 years ago. And we had a huge body of knowledge then, but it wasn't supported by a lot of research, and it wasn't really distributed well, right? But I remember going into this like pyrazines and thiols and alcohol and ketones and all this stuff. It's like, wow, it's all in there. How come we don't know more about it? And then Rob, years later, when I used to love wine, but then when this big IPA movement happened, and Rob obviously was a champion of that, and he was completely fascinated by this aroma profile that crosses over between hops and cannabis. And he hipped me to this book, right? You know very well, The Love of Hops. And it was in there plain as day, but it didn't say cannabis, it said hops, right? And it was about skunked bottle light affected skunking effect, whatever. And anyway, so we put it into an article in Cannabis Business Times, but it was just like a little hint of like, we don't know what the fuck is out there, but we think it's all the same. We think that if what you smell here is there, it just must be the same, you know. And I'll be like a total like outcast on this panel because you guys are like completely amazing aroma scientists and everything. But I'll just say this: we've come really far, but my fear is in our obsession of chasing aroma, we might forget that there's the love of aroma and the need and the safety and the things that it does for our brain in terms of aromatherapy and perfume and food. And then there's aroma and how it impacts the drug effect of cannabis. And I think in our world, those things are dangerously close right now and I had a really interesting conversation about this with someone the other day, that certain aromas are so powerful that it's not a receptor-based thing, right? It's about overwhelming the whole system of your body with a good, warm, fuzzy feeling. And then on the back end of it might come cannabinoids or other compounds that give extra layers to that. And then there's some aromas that are actually modulating and affecting the drug profile more. And so I had this conversation with someone who's an ethnobotanist and studies cannabis, and we were talking about that, and we turned to the conversation about spray packs and how spraying down cannabis. And I had this experience in South Dakota once where someone presented a joint to me, and the aroma that they were chasing was no longer the cannabis version of those aromas. It was just the aroma itself. So it wasn't the cherry notes that we all know in cannabis. It was just cherry, right? Because it's really bad brown weed that they're spraying with aromatic profile to give it. And the people smoking it were loving it, by the way. They're like, wow, try this. This is amazing, right? Because it took that part of the brain. It's hijacked that part of the brain. So, and then the other thing, so what this guy told me is the best spray packs out there right now are when they find really fresh, dynamic, aromatic cannabis, top tier flower, perfect flower, and then spray more on top of it. Because it delivers the drug effect and the relationship between aromatics and the cannabinoids and all the other unknown compounds. But then it pours up on top of it this thing that humans are highly susceptible to, which is aroma. And then it drives the decision maker of the decision of that consumer. And I think that that's a dangerous area to be in, especially right now as we're exploring how to add or preserve or create aroma around cannabis, that we don't want to lose what people sought out from cannabis. And that part of that is aroma. But most of that is about feeling good and feeling whole and feeling complete and feeling elated or relaxed or whatever, all the other. It is a drug. And at the core of cannabis it is a drug.
Yeah.
But aroma is more powerful than drugs because it's mom, it's safety, it's food, survival, right? So I always feel we have to really dance carefully there, especially someone who's bred and only smokes terpenally dominant weed that has a very little of that profile, that spray pack profile, because it's not food, it's not candy, it's more savory. And that it's the thing of the analogy of the child with the glass. You present a 5-year-old with a 30-year-old aged Cabernet, a $2,000 bottle of wine, and 99 on the Robert Parker scale, and you give that same kid a glass of Welch's grape juice, and they spit out the Cabernet right away because it's gross. But to someone who associates the effects of ethanol and the rich experience with all those aromas, they have a completely different experience. So
True.
as we bring aroma to as we deliver cannabis to people and as we deliver aroma to people, we have to be careful that we don't just present Welch's grape juice in order to appease that side of the brain which says that this tastes good, that cannabis is a drug.
Mojave, yeah. I mean, you're touching on, first off, great to see you. You need to stop by the lab again. That sage you dropped by was incredible. Such a classic terpenoline rich variety. But I think you're touching on something that I've long suspected, and we're starting to get data to kind of validate this a little bit. So when we do our GC collection, we're doing liquid injection. So we do actually collect cannabinoid fractions on our 2D GC. And so we can actually poke around in that area kind of with a little bit more resolution than maybe a traditional lab would. And we found at least 1 or 2 cannabinoids that people rarely discuss. One of them is completely new that we'll be publishing on probably later this year or next year. But the point being is what's really fascinating is whereas you don't really see a lot of relationships too much between terpene, super classes, what have you, terpenoline, myrcene, limonene, et cetera, and like THC content, like they can all be, the THC can always be pretty high with any of those sort of permutations of the terpene profiles. But we are seeing relationships between some of these minor cannabinoids. And so to me, that's the much more interesting thing where maybe these terpene classes or, these specific phenos, what have you, they have much more sort of dialed in or consistent effects across what people report and that sort of thing. It works very well for insomnia. This works, well for focus, what have you. I think a lot of these, these things that we're smelling could be just biomarkers for something else that's happening somewhere else in the plant. And so could it be that these, we're looking in the wrong place? Like we can see this over here, but it's actually correlated moving up and down with this other thing that's in small concentration, but it's bioactive and it's in low concentration, but there's enough there. And the differences between the classes makes us wonder, well, maybe that's driving some of what makes, these varieties, have that sort of medicinal effect over, others. And think about this. Everybody talks about distillate carts or, they're not quite the same. Well, they're not the same. I won't say they're not quite. Nobody would probably rather smoke a distillate cart that's flavored over, say, heavily refined over, say, something that's, like a full live resin or a rosin or something like that. Well, when you distill, you're not just removing necessarily some of the, obviously the aroma compounds, but you're actually removing other stuff as well that's slightly bigger than the cannabinoids. That's why you get this heavy fraction that people talk about, this wax fraction, which, by the way, we're working on a paper for all you extractors out there on that. It's really interesting stuff, kind of solving the mystery of whatever, this fats and lipids kind of conversation everybody's been having. Well, we know actually what that chemically is now. And so my point being is that I think you're completely right that it's like, yeah, we can kind of push the plant in different directions, but do they retain the same correlations with other bioactive compounds that might be actually doing more of the heavy lifting than others? And so I think as people move beyond THC, CBD, and look at the other minor cannabinoids, we're going to start to see these sort of relationships to the to the volatiles, at least in certain situations. And then that might explain why this one that's high in limonene and the terps look identical is very different from this one that's high in limonene and the terps look identical, yet they have 2 different effects. And so yeah, that's been a lot of fun. And so it's kind of going down the same rabbit hole that you're thinking right now, I think.
Well, he's definitely not wrong. Oh, go ahead.
Well, sorry, this is something that Ian brought up earlier, and you just mentioned it again. Is the way plants or a lot of organisms produce compounds is they produce them until they receive a biological stop. signal effectively. So like you hit a certain threshold, or there's a feedback loop in there, and it's telling it, okay, I no longer need this much of those compounds. Well, everything that's in that pathway is frequently just dumped into the cell, and it becomes sort of available for other reactions. Now you see this particularly in yeast for some positive aromatics and compounds, and negative compounds. And I imagine you see similar sort of these biofeedback and sort of almost like supply chain issues inside the metabolics of the plant. And so I wonder how much that's actually driving some of this.
Yeah,
Nick, another
precisely.
variable,
The
thinking
atom
about
economy
chemical signaling.
that Mark always refers to.
One remarkable observation is introducing a diversity of genotypes that are at maturity chemically signaling in ways that are impacting the volatile expression of adjacent plants. That's been something I've observed for a long time, and now I'm working with intentionally, but in border zones. You can induce new expression through absolutely nothing but chemical signaling between the plants. Marcus, sorry, you were chiming in.
No, I can't even remember what I was saying, but it does remind me of listening to Paul Stammen speak about a type of mushroom that can just grow next to another mushroom, not even be connected through its mycorrhizosphere, and literally acquire attributes, capabilities that the one mushroom has that the other mushroom doesn't. Forget about evolution, forget about a million years. It's like right then and there, bam, just growing next to it. So interesting concept for sure.
I think the other thing I was going to say to Mojave's point is the toxicology behind all this is widely still understudied, right? And under really a lot of microscopes, but there's not a lot of understanding as to how it's going to interact with the body in the ways that we have a lot of olfactory. I think all of us here collectively over the years have felt a lot of the things that we've seen papers be published on, or have experienced a lot of the things that have been studied, but we don't really know from a tox point of view where the cells would die and at what rate. And because there's no real body that's spending time on it on a daily basis with a large enough budget yet. There's some people doing work, but to Mojave's point, we don't really know what happens when you spray flour on top of what's already there. You just don't know. So I think that should be said out loud, So
One thing important to acknowledge is the ASTM, of course, has really been actively convening with the toxicology perspectives in mind. I'm sure you're aware, Dr. Shauna, who's on our team, has been really foundational in helping to support that safety perspective. Interestingly, through her interactions in ASTM, I've become privy to a global perspective of toxicology. And I will say there's been a lot more work done than most people think because of lateral mature industries. So tox people coming from other spaces where there has been heavily regulated products that have very advanced toxicology perspectives are now in that conversation. And it's in any case, there are, I would say, certain outliers currently in the product landscape that, based on what I've learned from the tox perspective, are really truly dangerous and awful and shouldn't be a part of the conversation, and continue to be due to the absolute mess of regulation, especially in the US. But globally, there's going to be a lot more
space, right?
Exactly. There, just put it like to put the fucking yeah, that. So if you're looking at a global perspective and looking at how European regulations are being handled, they're being handled by people who have dealt with that for decades and have had legions of scientists with massive, unbelievable budgets poring over these details. And I would say it's really one of the features, unfortunately, of the US domestic regulatory fuckery, that there's just such an inability to do mature science. I mean, that's why, I mean, Ian's work's an outlier, Mark's work's an outlier. Like all of like, it's just there's all these individuals who are passionate and some with some resources and so forth. But I will say I've spent almost no time in the US in the last year and a half, and I can see now that basically my career has moved into I have to like pretty much not work in the US anymore because we can't do the things that are where the maturation is going to happen. And it's maddening and frustrating, but I don't, that's just a rant. Guys, I'm going to go for dinner. It is an absolute privilege to be together. I'm so grateful for your inspiration and the knowledge that was shared. I miss some of the colleagues who could not be with us. And I just want to quickly give acknowledgement to Dr. Mark Lewis, who years and years ago, while on mushrooms on a boat in Amsterdam at ICRS, was talking at great length about aldehydes, esters, ketones, flavonoids, et cetera. And I think he's played an important role in this conversation and deserves credit. And also, I'm sad that Marshall Ligari is not with us today. I'd hoped that he would be. I will say that while Nick is incredibly sensitive to diacetyl, Marshall has some other sensitivities that blew my head off. The man is absolute unbelievable resource in our space. And I do think that in the future, it'd be interesting to call upon Vaishnavi Trivedi, who is on the True Terpenes team, a source of constant inspiration. I would argue that probably from a sensory perspective, I think she's the greatest talent internationally that I've ever met. And I've seen her mature and evolve over the last 4 years of working together to a point where she can do things that look magical to me in terms of sensory in our space. And I just think there are some other characters that would be wonderful to include in the future. But Marcus, and thank you for this. And I just hope the rest of the conversation goes great.
Yeah, thanks for all of that, Jeremy, and thanks for sharing some time with us. And Marshall is supposed to be showing up here in a little bit. Dr. Mark Lewis is at his child's Wizard of Oz performance. It's the last one. So I said, no problem. This will be the first of many aromatic volatiles. So yeah, go get some food in
didn't
you,
mention
brother.
Alec Dixon, of course.
Yes,
and
he
our
also
SC
was
Labs
invited.
fam. Yes. Okay. Anyways, much love. Thanks so much.
Thanks, brother.
Bye, Jeremy.
Yeah, interesting. So one of the things I wanted to mention in regards to going back in a little bit in regards to the water soluble, right? This was pretty early on for me. The first isolator hashes I saw were very drab. They had zero flavor. They were just not good at all. And one of the reasons why my nose helped me kind of do the work that I did in the last 30 years was that it led me towards cultivars that were just dank. Like I called it pot to get you busted because the tiniest little piece of it just reeked. It just saturated whatever room it was in. It was different. And when I ran that material through water, it retained the majority of its flavor profile. And of course, the only way I would know that is by running the same material over screens and then static sifting to get to 99% heads. And what I noticed was that, and it was something that I promoted early on, incorrectly for sure. I was just using terminology that was wrong, like, oh, these must be water soluble terpenes and they're getting leached away. So it was like, let's find the alcohol soluble terpenes. Let's find terpenes that don't melt away in the water. I don't know what was melting in the water. I do know that Kay from Trichome Technologies hit me up in 2014, and he was sitting with Sasha Shulgin, the chemist, and he said, listen, you got to get the aromatics out of the water that are locked away in the water and get them back into the hash. And he told me this in 2014, and he was talking about terpenes. And I ended up telling two people about that conversation. Literally within 5 minutes of having that conversation, I talked to Tony Verzura and I said, dude, you need to be making terpenes. And then I talked to Horatio Delbert. I said, dude, you need to be making terpenes, because I just wasn't going to be doing that. I just knew it wasn't my work to be doing. But Tony, surprisingly, had them very soon after. I suspect he was, because he was always very sort of tight-lipped about it. My theory is that he was at a very nice lab in Florida visiting when I asked him that question, and he probably just said to the guy next to him, hey, how do you do terpenes? And he said, oh yeah, you just do some hydrovac diffusion or steam distillation. The real trick is precipitating them back into a liquid through a chiller, right? That was the real key to making clear terps. Yeah, condensing the terps back into a liquid. And that was kind of the trick. Everyone else had yellow terpenes back in 2015, it was just yellow. They'd heated them up too much, but Tony was making like water clear aromatics that just smelled amazing. I don't like to call them terpenes anymore because I suspect he had a lot more there than just terpenes, but they were definitely kind of the beginning of us, having access to them and realizing that too much can be too much. Found that out really quickly with terpenes. And even just the incorrect way people would smell them. They just like open the lid and then just put them like right under their nose. I'd be like, oh, don't do that. Oh my goodness, you're gonna blow out your ability to smell those in the first place. But yeah, so we figured out the hash thing by just finding the rankest cultivars that seem to transfer the highest percentage of what we were looking for in the flower to be present in the hash. I'm sure there's always going to be things that were missed. And in fact, I used to kind of get into it with nicotine and be like, solventless really is a misnomer at best. I mean, we're putting it in water. And then he would always say, right, but we're not using it to like as a solvent. I'm like, well, we're not using it as a solvent, but it's clearly being one, because at the end of every batch I've ever run, that water has not been clear. It's always been a different color. So even though I didn't want to use it as a solvent, unfortunately, it is the universal solvent. And then later I learned that there were, the terpenes themselves were hydrocarbons. And so then it was like, oh, wow, this is like cannabis will never be solventless. And if it is, I don't want it. You know what I mean? I want this. I want the hydrocarbons in my cannabis and in my hash. Anyway, that's my rant.
Huff it. Huff them carbons.
I'm going to.
No, the one thing that I've always been fascinated by is in terms of aroma for cannabis, and I am very much jaded by my experience. I think everyone in terms of aroma and flavor, it's about their family and where they grow up, what kind of food you eat, what you think is palatable. So I grew up in spicy, incensey, aromatic world, right? So cannabis to me was always all of those things. And so that's always been my preference. But I also feel there's some correlation with all drugs and a lot of other substances, which is that they aren't supposed to be really that tasty. Like there's a shamanic thing about like the bitter pill, about the little bit of suffering and the little bit of pain that goes along with the healing and stuff, right? So humans have this kind of quest for like how much suffering can I get and still enjoy that moment, right? If you think of sour and bitter and hot and spicy food and stuff like that, or even wine. If you think of wine, I mean, we really pushed what tastes good because of the reward that came after it. And definitely like pepperheads are like insane, where they put themselves through this extreme amount of pain for all this endorphin release and all this stuff. And you think even chocolate, like the best chocolate is the chocolate that's almost like, to most people, to the average 5-year-old, is really bitter. It's too much, right? But to the chocolate connoisseur, they know they're getting the stuff that's in chocolate when they eat that, right? And there's this kind of high-end, high-quality things tend to push further away from pleasurable. Cheese, really simple cheese versus really complex cheese that most people think is either off or wrong or you shouldn't eat it, right? So I've always wondered, because traditional people have often done things to cannabis to push it in that direction. Like, let's remove the freshness part of it. And obviously it's a microbial thing. You're preserving it. You want to dry it out efficiently. But it went an extra step where they weren't just trying to dry it out and preserving it. They were trying to funk it up. And in the funking it up process, they were taking it down that aged wine, aged cheese realm, whether it was with hash or with corn cob, Malawi, whatever. And on the back end, they felt they got a better drug experience. And that's why they did it year after year. And that's why they taught their children. That's why their children adopted the preference for those experiences. And the new thing with cannabis, with freshness, that's really, really new, for one, because we have the ability to do it. But it's a different drug. It's a different experience. And I hear more and more, it seems to me that the needle, as it turned towards tastier weed, moved a little bit away from weed that got you really high. That's just my experience. And I hear that from, like the weed tastes better than ever. Like my ability to go find amazing, tasty weed is higher than ever for someone who's smoked for 30, 40 years. But the ability to find really irie, super stony weed is harder. So I'm like, are we in this weird crossover where are we going to end up with wine? Are we going to end up more with getting the drug effect here and the flavor here, and we just separate the two? Or is the flavor and the drug going to marry back together the way traditional people did? And because I have this haunting suspicion that we'll never be able to, once, like Ian, what you said, like once we isolate what those are aromatics and what those compounds that are actually active and having receptor affinity or increasing the potency of the things that do, that we won't be able to just add the flavors that people want to that without obfuscating it, right? So ultimately, we're not chasing aroma, we're still chasing effect. And if we're chasing aroma more than effect, then we might be washing out or moving away for this 1,000-year-old journey of us trying to get the most beneficial effect from the plant.
Mojave, I think one of the things that has been becoming more sort of evident, it's not conclusively proven yet, but there's an interaction between the experience and the effect, or the aromatic experience and the effect, that is stronger than like just having that same mix of cannabinoids in the same blend. Similarly, when you're talking about the effect and pursuing that particular drug interaction or what have you, or just the effect of the high or the physical effects, I think you're going to be seeing a lot more of work being done around sort of the minor cannabinoids, or the so-called minor cannabinoids, because we've seen, at least personally for me and many people I've spoken to, that combinations of like say CBG, CBC, and THC together are more effective at relaxation and sort of calming the mental down than just using THC alone, or THC and CBD alone. And so seeing those in confluence with the aromatics, I think is going to be what's going to lead to some really interesting effect-based breeding and production. And one of the things that, like, just personally, you mentioned sort of the concept of the bitter pill. I prefer it when things taste good. I have an objectively better experience if I have a wonderful watermelon, or not watermelon, like grapefruit gummy or something like that, or passion fruit, beverage or whatever it is, than just drinking, something very bland, or just like, just that something that's just bitter or on its own. I don't know how much of that is psychosomatic, but the pleasure and the endorphins derived from those pleasurable sensations, the aromas and flavors, give the sort of healing a bit of a kick for me. And so I think that's something that we shouldn't step away from, but I understand what you're saying. And I think that we've seen similar issues in terms of cannabis breeding, especially in the US for the last few years, is the prevalence of terpinolene dominant strains. And that's something that Jeremy's talked about at length. And he's seeing like he wants, stock that's not just terpinolene, because it overwhelms everything. And so, but it sells well, it's popular. Go ahead.
And Nick, no, I totally agree with you, and I think that's my point, is that I'm playing the devil's advocate. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm just observing it from like an outside observer, like if you were like an anthropologist or something, to see this change happening in the human plant relationship. And I think that because the reactions are so profound from pleasurable aroma and stuff like that, that's why the child, and I'm not comparing us to 5-year-olds. I'm comparing the industry to the 5-year-olds. That's why the 5-year-old who drinks the grape juice goes, wow, I get such an amazing experience from this. I feel safe. I feel happy. Where the Cabernet makes them feel gross. This is disgusting. I got to get this out of my body really quick. Because that's
grape juice to kids that grew up on Dime Tap.
Right, exactly.
We don't like it.
Right. But so my point is that if it turns that cannabis becomes this thing where it has these other, that the flavor and aroma becomes so profound and amazing, because it is, and this is also, it's the same with hops. So a lot of hops, like it got to the point where, and I love hazy IPAs, but it got to the point where it stopped being beer, where it was just like, holy man, this is not beer anymore. You can call it something else, but you've done such a good job of pulling out those aromatics in here that I could give this to my kid and he would drink it and go, "Hey, that's pretty nice, juicy, tropical, pineapple-y, slightly fermented thing you got there."
A friend of mine in the industry says nobody wants to drink beer that tastes like beer anymore. And it's and we also used to go to festivals when I was still brewing, go around and we'd kind of be snarky and say, "All right, is that juice or beer?" Because it was so, just like looked like orange juice. It was so hazy and gross. So, but
Right.
anyway.
And then I guess I'll just finish with this, in that the point I'm making is that people and how they make decisions. So the guy who made the hash for the community was the gatekeeper, right? It wasn't about everybody in the community saying what they want and him making hash the way they want it because they get the best experience for them. He's the hash guy. He's the shaman expert guy who delivers the experience that they think they should have. And when you listen to what people say, which is one of the reasons I sometimes have issues with the panel, the aromatic sensory panel stuff, is that if you listen to what people say and say, was this a pleasurable experience? Do you like this one better? People don't always make the best decisions. I mean, we live in a country filled with people who habitually don't make good decisions for the health and well-being of their body based off of their impulsive behavior for things like carbohydrates and aroma, right? So we can't let them be the ones who decide what's best. We have to let the gatekeepers, who are the ones that have been working with the plant and know it deeper level, just like the guys making hash, to be the ones to deliver what they should want from it. Because if we just let the people go, then all of a sudden, then you just have the same effect that you have, which is kind of, to me, why we've entered the fast food era of
Yeah,
cannabis.
then you get distillate, botanical terps, and floor sweepings. Best
And
joint in
spray
the country.
packs. Yeah.
Yeah, and spray packs.
Spray packs, exactly. Because
Did you see the documentary on spray packs, Mojave? Yeah, there's a documentary out of like Atlanta or something. I've been talking to the guy on Twitter. It's pretty eye-opening, man. Holy. They are spraying packs and loving it. Absolutely. I always go back to the same thing, that people have blown out their olfactories to the point where the botanical terpenes are something that they can finally perceive. And they are so excited when they perceive it. I mean, here in Canada, I'm certain that the number one SKU for pre-rolled joints would be a botanical terp distillate, milled flower joint. It would guarantee be. And I know Chris Baroni with his Clear brand did very much the same thing throughout the US, right? Very popular, always the most popular. Hurts my soul, but yeah, I just wonder, like, we've been banging our head against the wall for 30 to 40 years trying to get people more inspired to perceive cannabis on a deeper level. Is it that we have to teach them how to perceive before even bringing cannabis into the picture? Is there a way that we can propagate? Go ahead,
yeah,
Colin.
dude, I was gonna, well, the thing I was gonna say, kind of what you're inspiring me to think on is, and I often have thought this, but specifically when I was doing a lot of this formulation work over the past 3 years, was, we have so much influence from other industry that are so much bigger than our industry. And that could be beverage and food, it could be the tobacco industry. And I think watching the explosion of vaporizers in tobacco and those flavor profiles spill over into our world has been insane. I mean, it's really, I mean, not to discount the work that can be done and the things that I know that you're capable at abstract, but is it necessary? I ask myself often, you know what I mean? Can't we just grow the plants at scale and then extract everything we need and just say, hey, this is your color palette. Sorry, we don't go outside of the primary. But people want neon and they want all these things, as an example. But I wonder, you know, how do we fight against that? Because these people that come into the industry are looking at what in droves can sell for them easily, right? They're not willing to really do the work, and that bar is really low for them. So that high bar that we talk about in terms of cannabis profiles, these are things that some people just, they want their cherry, as you said, as Mojave as you used
Yeah.
before. And
Or
it's their
pineapple.
cough drop Luden's cherry that they're looking for, not a cherry pie that we all know comes from this bouquet of wonderful, amazing, complex, chemical constituents that make that up. But, you know, going back to one thing I think Mavi you said earlier about the flower itself, not being as terpy, is it because back 30 years ago, is it because we've evolved with learning how to do things in a much more contemporary way, and learning that, hey, we actually have to look at set points of relative humidity and temperature and all these things that before it was like chop the thing down and sometimes just let's trim it right then and there, when it's wet, for instance, as something that people used to do, and that alone is destroying the properties in which we all are after, which the aromatics. So I just wonder, sometimes, through the maturity of working with the plant itself, we've learned how to preserve these things, and as a result, like Jeff, I think Nick said it, they're now they're these new experiences that perhaps we didn't have before, because we didn't know how to capture those experiences and allow that to be a part of the if this is the analogy of color, the color wheel of feelings, so to speak. So I just want to put it back to the group, as we evolve, breeding for these aromatics, I think, is the next phase. There was, in the world of cannabis growing, I know I've been asked to grow things that are not as aromatic in the past because it was just too difficult to move it around. And now we moved into a world of like, can you just make it the most rank, crazy thing that blows the room out? Um, what do you guys think in terms of that balance, specifically Mojave? Where do you think we go with that? Is it big breeding programs, or is this just preservation? Like, what do you think?
Well, I think, Colin, I think you can't underestimate the impact of clone-only plants that got distributed in terms of aroma. That,
Yeah.
like OG Kush, for instance, right? OG Kush, before OG and sour or Kim were widely distributed, cannabis was all these different things, right? It was all over the place. And then when those plants they hit a button, they did something to the consumer. And I don't think the consumer automatically said, "Oh my God, that's killer weed." They just went, "Holy shit, I didn't know weed could be like that." Like it was just like they take a hit and they start chomping their mouth, like they lick their lips because the smell, the smoke left the residual taste, and that was
Yeah.
new. And then those clones went everywhere. So all of a sudden, cannabis, which was all these different things, all of a sudden became boom loud, right? Like we turned the volume up like in 3 or 4 years by distributing clones everywhere, and every breeder, including myself, even though I used OG and sour and I didn't select for those terp profiles, I used it to cross it into my stuff because no one could resist turning up the volume, right? And it was partially because, yeah, I just thought of a really fucked up story, but I'll just tell this. It was partially because of the effect, but really it was the marketing side. And this is the story. I knew a guy back in the day, one of the OGs, and he knew how powerful OG was. He knew that it was like a signal, just like Jeremy was talking about, chemical signals to other plants, right? Altering their chemistry, right? So he was fond of going to strip clubs. And he had a little thing. He'd take a bud of OG and he wouldn't put it in a plastic bag. He wouldn't put it in a jar. He'd stick it right in his pocket. He'd go and get a lap dance and watch the dancer freak out. Oh my God. And it was his little thing, a little bit of a predatorial thing, right? That he'd go out there with this OG signaler, right? Because it was powerful. It was that powerful, right? Now we took that and we put it as the backbone to almost everything in cannabis. So when modern people think of cannabis, they think of gas, they think of fruit, they think of these things that are like prevalent in a lot of stuff. but it wasn't prevalent between cloning for one, and then that clone went everywhere. So it really is. It's the skunk one Genghis Khan effect thing where all of a sudden this big aroma wheel gets narrowed to like the biggest, loudest neon thing possible, right? And then all the breeding work that happened after that to bring out all the cakes and the cookies and stuff through that same pathway, you know, and then all of a sudden cannabis is just this other thing really quick. And it's totally different than it was before because it's so much more dynamic. And just to that point of that dancer, it wasn't like, oh my God, you've got killer weed I want to smoke. It was, oh my God, what the hell is that? And that's like a evolutionary, I mean, you're not going to go around that. That's just like, it just.
So this spawns a question that I have for Abstract. Is like, Max came out to see me in the East Coast and we were hanging out and we were chatting about, I was talking about similar story. I was like, I grew Calio when I was a teenager and man, it blew my head off. I didn't realize cannabis could be that. I didn't know that this bouquet of orange and acrid orange could exist. And, he talked about the research that you guys had done with Tangy, which, Calio is the backbone of Tangy, those that don't know, crossed into Sam's work, actually, Skunk One. So, he talked about the new citrus compound that you had discovered through doing, countless studies, to get to that. Can you talk on how that came about and what varietal? I think, you did use Crockett's Tangy, right? Like, was that a clone? Was that from seed?
So actually, the very first time that we had ever really seen the breadth of VSCs that are not gassy skunky, but tropical citrus. And so these are the ones more similar to what you find in hops typically that are desirable. Thermocaptohexanol, thermocaptohexylacetate. But there's a few in cannabis that, Nick, I'd love your input here, that I've seen in cannabis, but not in hops through all the hop stuff I've done. Thermocaptohexyl butyrate, and then the hexanoate that we found last year. So there's a family of these cannabis makes. Nick, have you seen that in hops, the butyrate or the hexanoate?
Yes, seen both.
You have? Okay, that's fascinating.
Yep.
Yeah, because Tom told me he hadn't. So I'm gonna have to tell him that you've seen that.
Tom didn't have an STD.
Well, he had, and he's all big on the olfactometry stuff, which we have now actually because of Tom. But yeah, Colin. So when we first, so Kevin and Max were really big on Tangies. They just love those heavy dank citrus varieties.
Yeah.
And so, that we made it a point to, well, let's see if we can figure out this chemistry here, right? And it was back in like 22, I think, maybe 21, where we really had to crank up basically the mass going into the instrument to detect those ones. And actually using liquid injection, we actually see them more easily because they're slightly less volatile than some of the other VSCs. So when you do liquid injection, volatility doesn't matter anymore because you're shooting the whole mess of compounds onto your GC. But yeah, I remember seeing the first one we saw was 3-mercaptohexyl acetate in sour tangy. It was a rosin from 710 Labs, just because we can get it, easily around here. Mm-hmm. And and it smells amazing. It smells so good. We saw that. We then, tweaked some of our settings. We found the hexanol, and then we found the butyrate, and then we later worked out the hexanoate, the 3-mercaptohexyl hexanoate from another variety. It was another 710. It was a Starburst 36. But yeah, finding those, it was immediately obvious once we had this, the mass spec and then the structures, like, oh, this is going to make perfect sense for why it's generating these smells. And what's so cool about this, and so the reason why I think because we have about 5 or 6 kind of really unique compounds that are different flavors of citrus and tropical, that's why we have this kind of diversity within that sort of regime of citrus varieties that are probably all descendants from Calio, like you mentioned. Calio into Tangy, sour Tangy from that, blah, blah, blah. Now you have mimosa. Now you have papaya, which, by the way, these VSCs are in those. So anything that's kind of like, anybody would be like, there's a hint of tropical in there. You have some distribution of those compounds in there. And that's what's so interesting to me, is that because you have 4 or 5 compounds of the same family, so probably the same biosynthetic pathways, but they can still be tweaked slightly through genetics. I think there's a lot of really cool room there to keep pushing in that area of flavor space. because if you can like maybe take two of those out and raise one up through just breeding, you might be able to produce a new version, a really pure grapefruit versus kind of like a tangy sort of grapefruit, or if you go with the hexanol, Nick, I mean, again, you can probably remember this better than I. It's passion fruit, correct? I believe that's like one of its main aroma descriptors.
So if you have a ratio of 3 mmp and 3 mh at a 3 to 1, I think it's passion fruit. Sorry, other way around. Is that the 3 mh being the higher one is more passion fruit. The 4 mmp being higher tends to be ruby red grapefruit.
Gotcha. Yeah. So perfect example where, if you tweak these levels just slightly because they're so odor active, you can get a completely kind of new variant of a citrus smell that just, wasn't on the market before. So, to all the cultivators and breeders who are pushing in that direction, like, man, I don't know. And this is why I'll be honest, like I think all this new science is great that, we're doing and other people are doing, but it's not practical yet for breeders and people who are doing the work, right? And so that's why we try when we can to work with people, to help help them out, help the industry, whatever. But to me, it's like we need to get this into testing labs, right? We have to give you, Colin, you, Marcus, you, Mojave, the ability to be like, okay, I think I'm on something unique here. Maybe it's subtle, but if it's something unique, at least then you can be like, okay, I know it's there. And then you can track things quantitatively, which, hey, the nose is great. Don't get me wrong. But being able to watch things track, from a GC is, it to be honest, it's pretty, it's not only awesome, but it's also very validating because it's like, hey, I'm pushing this plant to make more of these compounds, through these different breeding practices. So yeah, I mean, those compounds are fascinating for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, the one thing I think Mojave brought up is like there are building blocks out there. He talked, sour is a great building block, OG is a great building block. In the flavor world, same thing. Lemon G is an incredible building block. Lemon Tree wouldn't be Lemon Tree without it. Calio is also a great building block if you can find it, because those compounds this is just what we've seen from a production standpoint and processing, is that those tangies stay. It's like why Superboof is amazing, is because it translates all the way through processing to the finest finished goods in the final form of whatever it is. If it's hash, it's incredible. If it's rosin, it's incredible. Same thing with Lemon G. So if you can work it to just from the plant perspective and the resin perspective to produce the type of resin that you're looking for and the plant characteristics from a morphology point of view and agronomy point of view, that's where the magic is, to your point. And that's where you can really push it into bigger realms. I mean, look what Starburst did. I mean, it came in as like in the hash world like a wave, and everybody was all about it because of that exact reason you just said, but if you look at the building blocks of that varietal, it has all of the constituents that you want to see.
Yeah.
With, you know what I mean, as a backbone, you know what I mean? So I think,
and Colin, what you and Mojave are kind of alluding to here, I think is sort of, okay, we have this genetic tree of cannabis, right? Okay, OG spawned all these varieties and then those and those and those. Something I've always been very interested in trying to map. And, the difficulties is if we don't know if a product is truly authentic, it's hard to trust that you're putting it in the right place on the map. But what I've always thought would be just so fascinating is kind of like that phylogenetic tree, but when did these metabolites start showing up, right? Because I've determined from thousands of data sets that the real OG Kush should not have a certain type of ester, because when I've gotten it from people who we trust, who Josh D here in SoCal, who kind of popularized it right here in LA. He has videos of him growing back in like 96 with all these plants and these crazy stories. It's wild. But when we measure his and we measure varieties that he might be kind of playing around in that phase space, we don't ever see this specific class of ester called synechioates. And so I mentioned this in our paper we published in 2023, where basically a lot of varieties that are more modern, especially kind of sweeter varieties, more sweet exotic, whatever you want to call it, candy, all that sort of thing, they typically will have these in like fairly substantial amounts relative to other varieties. And so if you go the opposite direction, so we've gotten in some like Cambodian haze crosses that were provided by somebody who got the seeds from Todd McCormick, who I'm sure you all know. And Todd, he's got really solid old genetics from Sam and other folks. But I always thought it'd be so cool to map out, when did this metabolite show up during the breeding process, right? Like, why did it, like when Calio emerged, it had presumably these therimercapto citrusy sort of compounds. Where did it come from? Unless it was just like a landrace, maybe it was. But my point is like, it would be really interesting to kind of map out how the progression of genetics has resulted in slight changes to the metabolic profiles that, give you more paint to paint with, right? There's more sort of chemical variety and diversity now to kind of play around in. And yeah, that jump between what I would consider like quote unquote true OG, where we do not see the specific ester class, and other ones that are downstream from it, we do see them. And so to me, that's like a really cool biomarker, because it's like, oh shit, I can almost tell how old or, how true OG is this versus, something that's older that doesn't have them. So, that's the sort of kind of cool, maybe like chemotaxonomic learnings that we can gain from this sort of work. And again, like if we could have a figure where like, okay, this variety brought in this chemical, this variety brought in this chemical. I mean, I think that would be just so fascinating, such a cool graphic.
Ian, like when Philo started, it was clear that one of the biggest issues that they had is they weren't willing to draw a line in the sand, right? And that was one of the things where we just said, look, if you guys don't draw a line in the sand, then it's just a bunch of noise. And you just brought up something that'd be awesome. Like, this has never been done, right? If you had you create like a genomics tree, a phylogenetic tree, but you draw a line in the sand, you find the people that you think have the best possible representation and like the most likely guys to have the oldest version of Calio or Skunk One or Hayes or Cambodia or whatever, right? You get the 100 guys, right? But the criteria is you can't just have the sample, you have to have fireweed. So we need to look at the weed that was grown not 20 years ago, but you got to have old school weed or weed along the whole family history here, but also new, fresh killer. We need both data sets because no one's ever done that. And that's really what we're trying to do here. Like, we're really talking about, I mean, the whole point about doing the phylogenetic tree is it's not botany. We're talking about drugs. We're talking about the market. You know what I mean? I mean, it's botany, yes, but the real reason, what does it support? It supports the industry, right? So that's the data that's so badly missing. And one other thing I want to bring up real quick before I forget is last week, you guys, I listened in on the show. It was such a good show, and the data that you guys presented, Colin, your distillate versus rosin chart, that's fucking awesome. And then also, I'm not sure who it was, whether it was Steven or you, who brought the AKG stuff. And it makes me think, because AKG is used for when are things psychoactive, right? It's the only definitive way to measure when something.
That's what the study was on. That's what we used.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
That was the standard. At least that was set forth.
If that was paired with the EKG work, was paired with aromatic work, what is going on, for instance, identifying which aromatic compounds have a psychoactive response versus all the other analytic stuff, because really that's all we're chasing here, right? So you've got the profile, you know where it is on the curve, and then you start tweaking it with different aromatic profiles to see if they have any impact whatsoever. You're going to get way better data then than trying to get any type of a receptor affinity type aromatic thing. And
so he presented one set of results, Mojave, that were really compelling. So he had, in his testing group, he was comparing a really terpy live resin vape pen made versus a distillate vape pen with just some store-bought terpenes added to it. And the data was you could see right away there was a peak. So he was measuring this PEL, which is some measure of
psychoactive something.
Yeah, psychoactivity level or something like that.
But
anyway,
sorry, just because this is really just, I'm just thinking about it out loud. But to Nick's point about the pleasurable experience, being
Yeah.
so necessary. So you have the first curve, which is just my pleasurable experience with the non-psychoactive. I just like the flavor of grape, right? And then you have the other one, which is the grape flavored weed, which has that curve. And then you add more grape flavor on there, and you see if when it has any type of an impact on that curve. Because I think what everyone wants to know is like, can you just take my profile of something that I've developed and then make it tastier? Or am I taking away from that?
Yeah, I think what I took away from this data, first of all, was the rapid onset of activity versus like the distillate pen. And then if you looked at the overall magnitude of the area under the curve, you could kind of gauge like how high people got, in a way. You're kind of like measuring the amplitude, right? And yeah, the amplitude of distillate barely got up off the baseline where the the live resin was way the hell up here. So yeah, I think it can be measured now, which would be yeah, super interesting
And
to couple with Ian's company had a really nice they had two booths at BizCon. Well, I'll let you explain it.
well,
Ian, they had one
yeah.
booth that was specifically for sensory analysis, right? So you could just walk up and they had different. Go ahead, Ian. You could tell them about it.
Yeah, so we've recognized, and I wish Jeremy was here because he's all about this, the sensory, bringing it into the 21st century for the cannabis world. So yeah, we've been there. There's a real lack of kind of infrastructure around that, and one of the hardest parts about getting good quality sensory data is again reducing the noise, meaning that people are trained correctly, that you have a large enough cohort of people to represent some approximation of how people's noses will respond. And part of that again is, if we don't know the chemistry, it's hard to train on something that we don't understand the smell, right? So that's why I think all this is sort of tied together. But yeah, we had a booth. We're developing a platform called Sensei. It's basically a streamlined process that we're using and we're building it for ourselves, but we'll make it available for other folks if they're interested. But basically, it's a streamlined way of capturing this data. It's all digital, so no pen and paper or anything. And it just gives you insights, on the back end that are, really, really good. And so we're still working on that, working out some bugs. But there was something else, Mark, you were just talking about before you brought that up.
Well,
What
it,
was
it
it?
seems like the perfect thing that you could apply AI to build a model. So
Oh yeah, yeah,
if you get enough inputs, like you say, that are diverse amongst that cohort, and yeah, so I see this in the lab all the time, especially like with sulfur. So with H2S, someone was talking about this before. You could almost get desensitized to it so where you don't smell it anymore, which could be super dangerous because if you're generating it, it is toxic, right? It's basically just the sulfur version of water, right?
yep.
H2S. And it's got that total rotten egg smell. And you would think again, like when I kind of weakly answered your question before, Ian, about evolutionary pressures. I mean, why the human sensory organ would develop a way of distinguishing something that smells like shit from something that doesn't smell like shit. I mean, there's an obvious thing to it. And I love here. So this is the that review from 2008, and I'll just read a quote. It says hop isohumulone, which isohumulone is the oxidized version of humulene, but it's basically on its way to doing all kinds of chemistry and everything. Degradation is the main source for well-known light struck off flavor in beers, right? This we're talking about beers, right? This should be music to your ears, right? Nick, you know this in spades. It said the main source what light struck flavor imparted, and then here's the compound, right? 3-methyl 2-butene 1-thiol. At high concentrations, 3-methyl 2-butene 1-thiol exhibits quite repulsive skunky odors, where at lower concentration, its odor is appreciated by consumers. So that's what it is in beer, right? And I think in beer, there's all kinds of chemistry that happens once this starts going on, right? Because there's a series of these isomunchone kind of nitrogen sulfur heterocycles that form, all create that kind of skunky essence, which is why beer lines need to be cleaned, right? Beer can foul pretty easily. Well, beer is foul, right? I mean, right? You've basically taken water and you fouled it, right? I mean, so it's just a matter of managing those notes. And it's so cool that, this is happening in hops and it's happening in cannabis, and that there's kind of synergy between the two, industries and trying to understand flavors here, right? I mean, at Abstracts, you guys are working on hops just as much as you're working on cannabis, isn't that right, Ian?
Yeah, which I mean, it's
More
taught
so,
me
no?
so much, over the last 5 years. When we first just bought some hops from, some pellets from a farm and running them and being like, oh wow, this looks really similar to cannabis in ways, but completely different in others, and it is funny that they're definitely, kind of from a metabolite fingerprint unique. And so I was looking for a plot to show you guys in the presentation just to kind of tie these families together, how they're similar, how they're different. But it's funny because when I plotted this on a PCA plot, and again, this is kind of it's biased towards the highest concentration compounds in this sense, but it was really fascinating because the hop distribution of kind of the 30 samples we had were kind of tight together. There's a little bit of variety. Cannabis was all over here. It was just like there was so much diversity because you have like terpinolene rich varieties, you have ocimene rich varieties, you have caryophyllene rich varieties. There's so much in the terpene profiles that are unique in cannabis that in hops it seems to be more constrained. I think I've seen a linalool rich hop variety once. Nick, I mean,
Uh,
can you
I
can
can
you
I can hit you up
yeah,
on that. Yeah.
please do.
So there's 7 major components of hop oils, and myrcene is usually between 40 and 65, up to 70% of those.
Wow.
And then you get linalool that's sitting down around between 1 and 2% if you're lucky. And then you can get geraniol, which is going to be similar to linalool. Then you get beta caryophyllene, humulene, cohumulene, all these things, right? In terms of the major aromatic ones, it's linalool, geraniol that stay in beer. It's linalool, geraniol, and then the rest of the 0.3%, or 0.3 to 1% of the aromatic compounds are what actually make it into those hazy IPAs that some of you love so much.
Right.
That's why we started looking at these survivables. Like you mentioned, having the two terpene profiles that were identical. We had a similar thing with hops, and one of them hops was Mosaic, and I forget the other one. But these are two hops that don't smell anything alike. And according to our traditional metrics of analyzing terpenes, they should smell identical. And that's when I was like, yeah, no, we're not looking at the right things. We're not looking at the right targets. So that's why we kind of moved. But a lot of those compounds also have, it's suspected they have pretty protective or attractive properties for the hop cones to attract predators to eat mites or to deter other bugs. And we see that in stressed hop products effectively. You can get some like brown hops that actually smell terrible or smell amazing when you'd expect them to smell terrible. It's because they got stressed, either through wind or hail damage or through mite pressure.
That's super fascinating. So I want to bring something up because Nick, you just mentioned something that reminds me of something. I made this connection recently. This is why I urge everybody, even if you're not necessarily a scientist, but try to read up on scientific literature in different areas. And so neem oil, I bought some neem oil at the store because I grow tomatoes in my house and I had some bug infestations. And I'd heard from all these cannabis folks that neem oil is good for insect repellent, what have you. Well, anyway, because just like everybody in this room, it sounds like I just smell everything because I love the experience of experiencing different smells throughout nature. And neem oil has a very distinct smell. If you guys have ever smelt it, it smells pretty gross, to be honest. And I was like, oh God, this has got to have some BSCs in it. And so anyway, I go into the lab, I run the neem oil on our GC with that, the sulfur detector on it. And yeah, it just lights up. It has all these unique volatiles that, they're not in cannabis. So, hey, by the way, in theory, you might be able to tell it's somebody who's spraying with neem because, they're mutually exclusive as far as their presence. But anyway, long story short, what was fascinating about it is I was like, oh, this is cool. These compounds exist in neem, give it its smell. So I go look them up. And it turns out that they themselves actually have some insecticidal sort of repellent properties by themselves. And so these compounds, which are, they're trivial in their chemical structure, but they're volatile. The neem plant presumably probably makes these in some amount as sort of like, creating almost like a barrier for certain types of pests to keep away. And so I thought this was fascinating because, we now know cannabis has all these VSCs as well. And we were talking earlier about the concept of, sort of how stress might change the chemistry within the plant. And then, that's what you might end up smelling. To me, it would be really interesting to see if perhaps certain types of mites, or, I'm not an insect guy, any sort of insect might be repellent by certain varieties where these things are very loud versus others. And maybe this has been observed anecdotally before, but it'd be great to put some science behind that, because who knows, maybe you could make a cannabis derived or a cannabis smelling insecticidal sort of repellent or something. No idea. I'm not a business guy, but that's kind of where my mind goes, is maybe you can actually take advantage of these characteristics that these compounds have.
I think there was a study done in a Russian hemp varietal that was high in geranol, which they did I think a two-spotted mite study with, and it repelled to some degree, I believe. But I think I know actually a group that's working on a bug repellent using just terpenes right now. So I do believe that's totally possible. But from a plant breeding perspective, I mean, I don't know. I mean, Mojave, have you ever seen anything that's like super high in geranol? I've never seen any. I've seen in minute amounts, but not enough to.
Yeah, I mean, significant amounts. I guess I can't, not off the top of my head. I'm not good at remembering numbers, but I have seen plant COAs where it did spike my thought. The first thing was that this is a known horticultural oil and you could easily be extracting it from cannabis. I mean, just like all the other things that you can relatively easily extract from cannabis, as opposed to the other plants that they came from before. Yeah, I don't know. It's fascinating though.
I think it's pretty conclusively demonstrated around on a lot of crops that if you add some of these things, it's really really repellent to a lot of insects, and to some extent other ones act as an attractant. So using sort of they mimic insect pheromones, and they'll bring in, if you find the right balance for the mite predators or ladybugs or something like that, you can actually bring them in. I would caution people on using neem or tea tree oil on on any cannabis plants, because yeah, they're fairly benign in small concentrations, but not when they're inhaled, and they tend to stick around for quite a while. So that's I would suggest finding something else if at all possible. Hey, folks, thank you so much for the time. I need to jet out of here. And Ian, I'd love to talk to you more about the sensory program you're developing, because I built one with a team at YCH that I think did a lot of what you're talking about. And so I'd love to see kind of where you guys are going with that, because it is a tool that's really necessary, and it would be great to have a standard for the industry.
Yeah, all right, definitely. Y'all. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you all so much for your time.
Hey, Nick.
Cheers,
Thanks
Marcus.
so much,
Thank you,
Nick. Appreciate you, brother.
Likewise, appreciate y'all.
Always good to go down the rabbit hole with Mr. Ziegler. That is for sure.
What a G. What a wealth of knowledge, that man. He's just amazing. What a cool guy.
Yeah, well, you know what? It's interesting because when he was working at Yakima, he said it was a unique situation, whereas a lot of the big hops companies, they want to find a couple of sort of cultivars and stick with that. And Yakima was the opposite. They wanted diversity. And so he was just constantly growing different hops and looking for different things, growing novelty instead of, the same old. And obviously that's where the excitement is, at least in the science, for sure.
In the hop world, Marcus, there have been like a few varieties that have had huge impact. So meaning like the USDA bred varieties that were released and stuff, which went on to become all kinds of things. So I imagine more so than cannabis and hops, if you do breed and select a new variety that has impact, you get a big chunk of the market, because it's not thousands and thousands. It's really just a handful. So I understand. I mean, as a hop breeder, it must be, like your likelihood is it's less likely to get a winner, but if you do get a winner, it's really a winner.
I'll tell you one thing: if you do have access to a hops extractor like Nick, who used one of those giant Thor custom jobbies, I think they spent about $10 million on that extractor. he has a very deep understanding of the parameters that are required to access the textures and the components that you're looking for. Because we were talking about that earlier. I think Jeremy was mentioning how it was unfortunate that CO2 got such a bad name in the extraction world because everyone just seemed to use these default parameters that just produce this orange doo-doo butter. It wasn't really until I met Mike West, and Mike West came up here to work at Embark, where he'd been playing around with CO2 since around '08 or '09. So by the time he got up to us, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, he had a very deep understanding of those parameters, and it was just it was rare in the cannabis world to find someone that just had an understanding of that rather than just pumping that same template SOPs of just like, wow, this is what we were told to do, and so I got to watch the numbers and make sure it all. It's like, all right, well, whatever you need to do, I guess.
Supercritical is a hot extraction, right?
You know what? We still have a brand new CO2 5,000 psi EU GMP 90-liter CO2 extractor that never even got turned on. It's brand new. It's like sitting in a box. It's like just sitting there. My partners tried to sell it. I think they went down as low as 150 grand, and it's like an $800,000 machine with the receipt unused, and even the company came out and did like the background on it, the audit on it to present it to any buyers that showed, yeah, it's new, hasn't been used. Just too many people in Canada with those things sitting in crates in their facilities. It's really unfortunate, actually. Hate to see any type of equipment just not being used, I always told people, they'd be like, these bubble bags are pretty expensive, like, is it worth it? I'm like, as long as you don't put them under your bed and not use them, it'll absolutely be worth it in some way, shape, or form. Now, if you put them under your bed, because the odd person would tell me that, I'd be like, hey, how did those bags? Oh, they were useless. I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, I put them under my bed and never ran them. I'm like, well, that's you being useless, not the bags. Bags are just a tool, man. Come on. Got to swing the hammer
Mark,
to get
is
it to work.
CO2 a good extraction method in your opinion from an efficiency point of view, or is it more targeted than ethanol? Is it
Are
something
you
that
asking me?
yeah. Yeah.
Supercritical is hot, right? It's above like 78 degrees, right? I mean, it's hot. It's going to melt waxes, and I think the promise of CO2 is that you can do an extraction and then do selective letdowns at different pressures to fractionate your fats
Exactly.
from your lipids and your terpenes. It's not that clean. It's not that easy to do that. I mean, it can work, but from what I remember, it was a really long extraction, right? It was like
Yeah. It takes
several
like 8 hours.
hours long. It's like,
Feet
fuck,
or something.
we could have emptied out a butane extractor several times in
Yeah.
the same time, even making water hash. I mean, I don't know, like the scalability, I mean, certainly like I think it was oversold, Marcus. I think like if you went to
Oh, it was
MJ
totally oversold.
MJ
99% of people
BizCon,
that bought it had no idea. It's too bad we
yeah,
didn't ask this question while Nick was here, because he ran a unit for years at like 4,000 pounds an hour
yeah.
of
If
We
you
had
extraction.
one. I had a
if you
two
Yeah, I was
liter
just gonna say
liter
if you
column
went to
one.
BizCon like around
Yeah.
2018, 2019, it
Yeah.
was all just big shiny tanks, right, Colin?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You walk the floor, it was all these companies trying to sell
Yeah.
extractors, a lot of European companies and German companies and companies that, just said, oh, okay, there's a new, thing to extract, right? We've been extracting, I don't know, whatever
We
sugar
had
for
that at
years. Now we're
museum.
going to extract cannabis. And I think they tried to do like a one size fits all solution to it.
Mhm.
And it's a hot extraction, right? I mean, so and the other thing is that it doesn't do well with water, right? So if you're doing like a live extraction, can't extract live material. You can only extract dried material. I know that like some people were able to fine tune it to where they can get a nice terpene extraction. I've had CO2 extracted terpenes. They are proper. But I think
Yeah.
the scalability of it was never going to be what other methods could do. So I don't know. That's just where I come down on it.
We had a 210-liter column unit that we had up in a license up in Massachusetts. So there was a department running that, and just seemed like 8 hours to get through two columns like that seemed like a lot of time, you know?
Right?
So I don't know.
Well,
Productivity.
I think that's why everyone just uses a co-solvent. It's like it's pretty easy fix.
Yeah.
You
Or
get it
just
down to
keep
like
water
2 hours. Yeah,
Just
I
keep
mean
water.
that's what I do, but
Yeah.
that takes longer than 2 hours,
It's
and
true.
it's laborious.
Well, you could
And
do a hydrocarbon cycle in less than an hour, with a good recovery pump if you're,
yeah.
doing active recovery. And I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of that guy in Colorado. There's a guy in Colorado who is pretty known for his CO2 terp extractions, and I've had his pens before, and they taste great. It tastes proper. I just don't know how it scales, like how productive that is in
It
production.
doesn't, so what I remember, I had to bring in a microwave chirp extractor to the building to catch up with the demand because they just couldn't produce enough. And then they ended up doing blends with the terp extractor that I brought in. And that was a learning curve too. That was early. It was like 2017 when I did that. It was interesting, but there's far better ways to get there as you're highlighting.
Well, I've had to fight like regulators who are against, hydrocarbon extraction because they're like,
Yeah.
ooh, CO2 is much more safer. And it's like, really? CO2 is pressurized up to a couple thousand PSI, and this butane extractor is 40 PSI, right? What do you want to stand next to, Something that's pressurized to 1,000 or something that's pressurized to just, 40 or 50 PSI. And I guess what I've given this spiel a couple times for regulators. What they don't realize is that, in everyone's backyard, right? They have a propane tank hooked up to an igniter, in their gas grill, right? And they're worried about, butane extraction and closed loop systems. All of the systems that we put in, we always do, the C1D1 room, proper plumb, everything through the wall, and you got to pay for that and everything. But ultimately, that type of solvent extraction is going to kick ass over CO2 any day of the week.
Yeah,
Mm.
that makes sense.
Yeah, over in the hops world, because I've been up to Yakima to like Barthos, one of the big producers. I mean, they have huge industrial scale stuff, but it's primarily used just to isolate the acids. So, kind of like if you were using CO2, the analogy in cannabis would be if you really cared the most about THC or THCA, I guess, right? Because what comes out of the oil in the hop world is just from a fragrance standpoint is not good. And so
It
these
doesn't
companies,
decarboxylate at that temperature.
what are you? I'm talking about for hops now, Mark. I
Right.
don't
So
know.
they're not prone to decarboxylation, those kinds
Well,
of
the acids
acids.
don't are not. It's different chemistry, right? Hops
Right.
don't have the same sort of functional groups.
Right.
So it's mainly like humulone and cohumulone. These are the bittering acids that people need in Bud Light. And somebody mentioned in the chat like they need it very standardized. That's very true. And so when you do these huge amounts of a single variety at a time, it kind of normalizes all of the differences between lot to lot variability. But yeah, I mean, if you apply that to cannabis, basically there's a lot of the stuff that comes with it, right? There's waxes and whatnot, and people might have been able to kind of play games with it, but at the end of the day, this is part of the work we're doing is showing how butane is naturally selective, for the most part for what you want. And so we did a few different extraction temperatures using butane at our facility in Long Beach, and you can basically systematically watch that wax fraction just drop down to, I think the lowest that we got, and we were at like negative 50 C or so. I know people go lower, but it's diminishing returns at that point as well. And having a large chiller run a large unit in the middle of the summer, that you run into issues with the infrastructure at that point. But yeah, so I mean, that's why butane I think is just so good. You can freeze out a lot of that junk that you just don't really care about. Hey guys, look, I don't have much time left. I got two things that I think you guys would be interested in just on my slides that I'd like to just kind of show and go over two little stories, and then I can bounce. Does that sound all right, Marcus?
It's perfect. I was gonna cut it short today at 2 o'clock so we can go a few minutes over and finish off your presentation, and then I'll thank everyone for coming out, and I'll go pick my son up at his fishing tournament and see if he caught some walleye.
Oh yeah, man. Awesome. Well, the first one, I saw somebody ask this in the chat, so I figured I'd throw it up here. There's this kind of debate that I think's been had around the industry about different lighting sources for indoor growing. And so we were lucky enough to catch Josh D again, who was cultivating the OG. This is about 2 years ago now, but we finally kind of put it together. But he was cultivating this in the same room, but half of it was HPS, half of it was LED. So plants in the middle were kind of getting mixed light there, but the ones on the outsides were more or less only getting either HPS or LED. And so we hit him up. We're like, hey, send us over some of your flower. We'll measure it, see if we see any differences from the metabolomics. And what we found is, there's some subtle changes, but to be honest, there's not a ton. And so really this, we were interested in if these gassy compounds would be changing under LED versus HPS. So we see a small change in THC content, which again, people care about that. So we're showing that basically, not a substantial difference there. The terpene profile concentrations were identical in essence. They weren't statistically significant. And then when you look at just these volatile, these sulfur gassy compounds like prenyl thioacetate, they're fairly similar too. The only thing that we saw that was really different between the two lighting sources was the LED morphology. The bud morphology was much tighter than the HPS. And this is something Josh had told us. He's like, yeah, man, I really, I like the HPS because that's what OG is supposed to look like, right? OG is supposed to be kind of like light and kind of fluffy, not super tight nugs like a lot of the more modern ones are. But anyway, I thought this was really cool because it basically shows that you can kind of fine tune the density, at least in some circumstances, maybe not all, but at least in this OG variety, he was able to do that while retaining pretty similar sort of key chemical metabolites. So I thought that was cool. The next thing is that we did, because we were talking about kind of like how sulfur is metabolized by the plant, and there are these microbes that can kind of eat sulfur and convert it into something more functional and more useful. So when we first found these metabolites, we were interested in determining if, well, hey, does just excess sulfur in any salt form, specifically we use potassium sulfate, does that really change the outcome of the metabolites that are expressing in the plant? And so the question was, would higher sulfur salt content increase VSC content? So we did this study. We were working with just a local grower, and so we only took 2 plants. So again, I don't think this is like not publication quality, but I still think the results are probably, fairly consistent. We took 3 from each plant, 3 samplings from each plant to get an average across them. But what we found is that the other thing I'll mention is that, we weren't seeing a lot of changes early on when we were using a very small addition of the sulfur salt. And so towards when we flipped over to flowering or whatever it was, we decided to, let's throw in excess if we're not seeing a change, both from a plant growth perspective, like we're not seeing, leaf burning or any of that sort of thing. And so that's what we did. We literally just kept throwing more and more in because we didn't know what the range was at the time for throwing in too much potassium sulfate for the reservoir size versus too little. And so we probably started way too low for the reservoir size that he had. But anyway, we ended up tossing in quite a bit excess of the potassium sulfate by the end of the grow. But what we found is that we do see a little bit of differences between the cannabinoid content, slight increase in the experimental group versus the control. And I have this moisture unadjusted and moisture adjusted because this is something if you, and maybe people have noticed this, but we've done a few studies since then where we're kind of modifying salt content by bumping up one of them. What we've found consistently is that the amount of moisture retained in those plants where we're adding the excess salt actually resulted in more kind of like with the same length of curing and drying, a higher moisture content. So the control plants came out of this at about 12%, 11, 12, kind of like where you want it. And then the experimental were actually at about 14. And so, when we got the flower in and we did the water activity test, like, oh wow, that's actually, a little higher than we were expecting. So there is that wrinkle in the data too. But what we found is that basically there wasn't a huge difference. So on the left are the individual plants, on the right are, just averaged together. And basically what this is showing is at least potassium sulfate, maybe a different sulfur source like mag sulfate or calcium might have
Ammonium
a different
sulfate.
result. Ammonium sulfate would be a great one because now you're adding sulfur and nitrogen.
Exactly.
But I want to just provide this data for any listeners who might be, interested in seeing if you can tweak some of the metabolite profiles just by, tweaking the, the inputs. And it looks like potassium sulfate is probably not the right direction to go. But again, technically it wasn't cured quite as long. We probably should have let it go another day, those two that were spiked with the excess nutrients. But yeah, just thought I'd present this data because I thought some of you guys out there might appreciate it. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, I know we got to hop off. I'll try to quickly answer any.
No, appreciate it, Ian. It was a great conversation today. I sent you my digits in the private chat so we can link up. I don't want to have to go look for the email, not find it, and then reach out to Dave and be like, hey, can you give me? So I got my number right there for you. I want to thank everyone for coming out today. Dr. Mark for helping organize this show. Nick Ziegler, Jeremy Plum. Wonderful to see those guys. Mojave, super stoked that you popped in. Colin, always a pleasure, my brother. And yeah, really was stoked to see just happy to see the direction that you guys are going in. And I hope this is really just the first of many shows about the aromatic volatiles of cannabis and the olfactory and sensory science. Marshall unfortunately wasn't able to make it, but I wanted to thank him as well. We'll see him on the next one, I'm sure, as well as Dr. Mark Lewis and Alec Dixon from SC Labs. And who knows, also maybe the woman that Jeremy had mentioned is a superstar in her own right. So always happy to have these conversations. Thanks everyone for watching. I want to thank the Press Club for their sponsorship of the show today, as well as Puffco. I was puffing on mine the whole show. Yeah, may the full melt bless your bowl sooner than later. We'll see you next week. Peace out, everyone. Much appreciated.
Hey, everyone.
Bye, everybody.